Yeah, okay, great. So we're going to spend the next plus potentially infinite amount of time going through a paper and talking about it together. It's obviously not the first time we've read this. Each of us has read it before, as will become apparent as we go through, I think. So for a bit of context, we are looking at Andrew Loke and Eli Heitov's paper in this year in a journal called Analytic Philosophy. The paper is called A New Hilbert Hotel Argument Against Past-eternalism. If you just Google Andrew Loke, you'll find it. It's open access, so anyone can read it. And we'll be showing it on the screen as we go through. This is intended to be a thorough critique, but not a personal attack on either of the authors, neither of whom we actually know personally. I've spoken to Loke in person in the sense that I did an unbelievable episode. Did you also talk to him, Dan? You did, didn't you?
Yeah, we did a debate on, I think it was on Cameron Bertuzzi's YouTube channel.
Yeah. So we both met.
That was in like December or something, right?
That sounds right.
But anyway, the point is just that this is not a personal critique of Andrew Loke or Eli Heitov. I don't know them. No interest in really saying anything about their personalities or anything. But we do want to talk about the paper, and we think we've got a lot of criticisms of different things about it, and we're not going to hold back with those things. Just wanted to make sure this was clear that it wasn't like a personal attack on either of the authors, who may well be perfectly reasonable. They might be hideous human beings for all I know, just like anyone might be. But anyway, so because I'm a stunted, backwards old person, I can't get my IT stuff to work properly. So Troy's gonna share his screen and like show the paper as we go through it. I guess, do either of you want to give any more background about the paper before we start going through it?
No, I mean, if we want to do background, we talk more generally about Hilbert Hotel, I guess, but maybe that will come up as we go through it. I don't know, we could.
Yeah, I think if you don't know what Hilbert's Hotel is, you're in the wrong YouTube video.
Yeah, I mean...
Yeah.
Sorry, Dan, sound like you were going to say something then.
Oh, no, I mean, I think we could just present the basic argument and then how this is supposed to be a new contribution to the dialectic concerning that argument.
Yeah, okay, good. And I think we might be slightly out of sync, Dan, so like it took you 3 seconds to react to me, so just bear that in mind.
Yeah, it looks like Dan's connection's a little bit wonky, but it should be okay.
Yeah, well, I think my computer is overheating, so maybe I should go off of... Maybe I should get rid of my camera. Maybe that will help to...
Yeah, our cameras are probably not even needed.
So you'll still be able to...
Yeah.
So you'll still be able to hear me, but I'm going to turn my camera off.
Okay.
Yeah, that's fine. Okay.
All right, so part of the basic dialectic that's going on is Craig's got this Kalam cosmological argument where it's supposed to show that the universe had a beginning and that must have been caused by God. And that's got quite a decent sized literature with people going back and forth on different aspects of it. And Loke's chipping in on some of the discussion. And in particular, he's responding to a paper by Landon Hedrick from 2020 called Heartbreak at Hilbert's Hotel, and also a paper by me and Wes Morriston called Endless and Infinite. And so he's sort of coming back, throwing a few punches back in the other direction from those two. So that's kind of where it is in the dialectic. He's sort of defending Craig, I suppose, Craig's Kalam argument from some of these pesky atheists coming up here with their objections and stuff. So that's the sort of most broad brush context to it. And I guess zooming in a little bit, if you don't know what Hilbert's Hotel is, you're probably watching the wrong stream, but the idea is it's supposed to be a thought experiment that shows you that there couldn't be like a concretely existing thing that was infinite, like a hotel which had infinitely many rooms in it, for instance, and it displays weird behavior, like loads of guests could come and the hotel could already have a guest in each room, and the hotel manager just makes them sort of move to different rooms, and that frees up infinitely many rooms without anybody checking out. There's kind of like weird things that Hilbert's Hotel does that Craig makes a lot of fuss about and says that means you couldn't have a Hilbert's Hotel. And basically, Loke is trying to amplify that point and saying, yeah, you really couldn't have a Hilbert's Hotel, despite what all the atheists have been saying about it. Right. So that's like my broad brush. I don't know, Troy, Dan, if you wanted to say anything else to set things up.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's an important point here about how this is supposed to be addressing the dialectic, because so on the one hand, many participants in this debate will admit that you can construct a bit of mathematics that includes infinity. So if you wanted to, you could, for example, construct a set of numbers that has infinitely many members, like the set of integers, for example. And that's all logically consistent. But it's supposed to be that a set of concrete objects, a set of physically existent objects, Craig, Loke, and others think couldn't be part of reality. And one of the challenges in this literature is to say something about why it is that what makes a concrete collection distinct from an abstract collection. In this article, part of what Loke and Hightower argue is that there's something about causation that makes it so that concrete collections couldn't have infinitely many members. That while concrete items can have causal powers, for example, abstract collections of objects don't have causal powers. At least that's what's typically thought. And then there's going to be some kind of paradox, I think, that arises once you have an infinite collection of items with causal powers.
You've said a bit of introduction. Troy, was there anything else you wanted to add about this?
Yeah. Well, I mean, this is going to be stuff we'll get into anyway. But yeah, as Dan suggested, they're really going to be appealing to certain facts about causation. In fact, there's a certain causal principle that he employs to argue that, yeah, these sorts of scenarios with infinite hotels or other things like that are impossible. They violate some true causal principle, and so ruled out. And then they are going to go on to argue from there that, well, not only is Hilbert's scenario impossible, but an infinite past is impossible, because if it were possible, then the Hilbert's hotel would be possible, which is false. So yeah, we'll get to those arguments in the course of this discussion, but that's the kind of general structure of their line of reasoning here.
Yeah, and then we'll see that there's 3 arguments that the authors present in the course of this paper, at least 3 that they sort of number and refer back to, and we'll sort of hit them one by one and show how the authors think they work dialectically. But I think from now, let's just crack in. I don't suppose we're going to actually read out loud each of the words of all of it, but the introduction is him saying, like, that there's some objections to it. It's a bit like what I was saying before, Craig rolls out Hilbert's Hotel. People like me and Morriston and Hedrick have published responses to some of that stuff. So that's basically the introductory bit. And that's kind of basically also the background of it as well. So he sort of summarizes what me and Morriston and Hedrick's papers were in more detail. Do we need to bring that up now, do you think? Should we go through all of that as well?
Maybe not. I did want to just add that one objection that they want to avoid here is that is thinking that their argument would apply equally to an endless future, and they think that their argument does not equally apply to that, and that it rules out infinite past without ruling out an endless future. Maybe we'll come to that. That's sort of toward the end of the paper, but I think most of our criticisms will be on the parts before that. But yeah, that might come up.
Yeah. So without going into too much of the detail on that, then Hedrick's idea was that so Loke had this version of the Hilbert's Hotel argument where it's like, instead of just thinking that the past, the beginningless past, just like is like Hilbert's Hotel, because each day is a bit like a guest in the hotel or something. He says because the problem with that is you end up having to sort of say loads of stuff about philosophy of time and like what is an event and what is a moment in time, blah blah blah. And it kind of gets bogged down in talking about A theory and B theory and whatever. So you might think we can just sidestep all of that stuff, and if we had a version of the argument where an infinite past would mean that there could be an object where it was all present at the same time, so forget all the philosophy of time stuff, which was infinite, like a hotel. So one way the way he cooks it up is to say, imagine there's a beginningless past, and each day in the past, some agent, let's say God, has been making one hotel room per day and adding it to a hotel. And then if that had happened, there'd be a Hilbert's hotel existing right now. And so it's not about like the infinity of the past being like Hilbert's hotel. It's just like the Hilbert's hotel that actually concretely exists right now is the problem. So if they're an infinite past, then there could be an actually infinite thing right in front of you right now, is his idea. And so Hedrick's reply back, been a while since I read it, but it was something about basically kicking up sound in part of the premise where it supposes that God could sort of create ex nihilo every day. And it was a load of issues related to the plausibility of that assumption and like how ex nihilo stuff works at all. And me and Morriston were doing one of the standard sort of Morriston moves about like showing how the argument, if it applied to the past at all, would apply equally to the future. And if it did that, then there's an issue if you think that the future is sort of endless, like Christians who think that Christianity helps them escape death or something. They want to continue forever and ever in the afterlife, just like they do when they're alive. So it's quite difficult theologically to suppose that your conscious experience comes to a full stop at some point. That's all goes against arguably the point of religion at all, which is to make you feel better about death. So anyway, those are the two sort of backdrops to it. And let's go on to, I guess, section 3. Is that enough to say about section 2? I think really he's just summarizing what we say, more or less.
Right. And then Hendrick, yeah. So then they go on to say, we think we can formulate the argument in a way that doesn't run afoul of this objection. We lost Dan.
I'm sure he will join again. I think we just need to keep going when this happens.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay, so section 3, starting off.
Yeah.
To begin, consider Proust's objection of the failure to perceive the distinction between arguments against. Actually, I've just remembered, I do want to just bring up one thing before we move on to that, actually,
Sure.
which was this stated aim, like right at the beginning. I think the sort of end bit of the second paragraph, underneath the quote from Craig, go down again, and then this larger paragraph underneath, right at the end of that, he says, while they grant for the sake of argument that concrete infinity, such as Hilbert's hotel, are metaphysically impossible, they maintain a skeptical assumptions. Yeah, no, that's right. And then, but the point I wanted to bring up was that he's trying to say, or they are trying to argue that it's like logically impossible for concrete things. And it was that combination that I was the more I thought about it, the more strange that sounded, because I just took it that what does it mean for something to be logically impossible? It means that from just the axioms of logic alone, without any assumptions about what exists or whatever, you can show that the thing in question is contradictory. Like that's what it means for something to be logically impossible, is that logic alone shows its contradiction. But then it doesn't make any sense to say logically impossible in concrete reality or something like that. It's just got nothing to do, like whether it's in concrete reality or not, it's got nothing to do with it.
Well, so this is something that I was going to bring up actually when we come to the first argument, but because it came up in I had a somewhat lengthy discussion about this paper with Andrew Loke on Facebook. We had an exchange that was somewhat productive, and we'll get into some of the details there. But this is one thing that came up, which is that I'm fine saying, look, maybe there's some sort of contradiction involved in saying that concrete things engage in these sorts of causal relations, blah, 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 whatever. Maybe like you could argue that there's some sort of contradiction involved in that. And maybe the qualifier that is concrete things makes a difference there, right? But the problem is that if his argument appeals to or relies on non-logical assumptions or extra-logical assumptions, then he can't infer from that that it's some logical impossibility, right?
Yeah.
And as we're going to see, I think it's quite plain that his causal principle is not a principle of logic, right? So he can't derive some logical impossibility from that. And I think that was one of the sticking points in my exchange with Loke, but we'll get to that more when we get to that, I guess. But if you want to say more about this issue now.
Yeah, I think it's just a terminological issue, because I think there is in the common vernacular, even in academic speak, various different notions of contradiction. For instance, communist theorists will talk about contradictions in the Marxist sense, where it's like a struggle between those own the means of production and those who don't, or something. But it's not a contradiction in the logician sense, right?
Right.
And that's if that's what we mean, then a contradiction is just in this. Forget this sort of Wittgensteinian idea. Contradiction just basically means a proposition and its negation, right? Just P and not P, and that's a contradiction. And fine, you could have it that P concerns something that exists concretely, like this cup exists and this cup doesn't exist, in which case you've got a contradiction, a logical contradiction, if you like, and it concerns something that exists concretely. But I mean, the term logical, and once we're clear that we mean the term contradiction not in a kind of Marxist or some other deviant sense, but in a sort of thing like a proposition and its negation, at that point that's just done its job, then the logical prefix. And it gets confusing, I think, and I think this is where they go wrong, is that they think that what's going on is that means the modality is logical possibility because it's a logical contradiction, right? And that's just not the case, right? It could be. So the point is that logical possibility is about what happens if you've just got logic. Like, what happens? What is this proposition provable? Is its falsity provable, or is it in between? That gives you necessary, impossible, and contingent, right? But then if you supplement logic with some other axioms about like some other thing that's true, maybe that unicorns exist, or that God exists, or that like it's Tuesday or something, now you can derive further things. But you've supplemented some axioms, you've added in some claims, and they might be claims about metaphysical truths like time can only go forwards, or God exists, or something like that. In which case, I think then you have to start saying that the modality you're characterizing is no longer purely logical modality. It's something more like metaphysical modality. Like, for instance, if you have give me classical logic and all of the laws of physics, and now I've effectively supplemented some axioms to classical logic, and the resulting modality we're talking about is physical modality. Like anything that's logically consistent with that enriched set of axioms, that just is physical possibility. That's just what we mean. So I think it's like there's this confusion that they think it's logical modality just because there's a proposition and its negation. That's not enough to tell you if the modality is logical.
If that's what they think, then I have a hard time understanding what happens on page 3.
Okay.
So this is where they're talking about.
Version.
Yeah, that'd be helpful. But there's a passage on page 3 that's actually I'll give you a chance to pull it up.
Let me just share. Hang on, my.
I will do the same.
Is it this one or is it this one? It's this one. Can you see this now?
Yes.
I don't know if this is better to have it this way then. But at least.
Yeah, well, at least now I can use the page numbers.
Right.
So if we go to page 3, then there's a paragraph on the left-hand side. Yeah, there we go. This paragraph about mathematical possibility. And what they're dealing with here, this is an argument that Locke has given in various different places, is supposed to be that there's a distinction between what's mathematically possible and what's metaphysically possible. And the distinction is supposed to be something that to do with this quadratic equation, that So the equation he gives is that x squared minus 4 equals 0. There are two solutions to that equation, right? So x equals 2 and x equals negative 2. And then he says, well, look, if you're trying to ask this question like how many people carry the computer home, and you're modeling, for whatever reason, we're supposing that we're modeling the people that bring the computer home using quadratic equation, even though the equation has this negative root, it doesn't make sense to say that there are negative 2 people carrying a computer home. And that's supposed to be a metaphysical impossibility, they claim. I guess the idea is supposed to be that given what people are, there can't be negative 2 of them.
Okay,
now,
fair enough.
Right.
There's all sorts of problems I have with this argument, including that I don't know what it means to say that negative 2 people carrying a computer home is mathematically possible, but not metaphysically possible. But setting all of those other objections to one side, it seems like in this paragraph, Locke and Haitov are distinguishing between mathematical possibility, logical possibility, and metaphysical possibility. If they allow for that threefold distinction, then it can't just be that they think that a logical impossibility is just whenever you have a contradiction.
Well, no, it's whenever you can derive a contradiction without supplementing logic with any axioms of any type, just pure logic on its own.
Yeah, but in order to say that there can't be negative 2 people to bring the computer home, well, what you would do is you'd supplement the mathematics with an additional principle, where you'd say that the situation is modeled by x squared minus 4 equals 0, ampersand x is greater than 0, or x is greater than or equal to 0, I guess. Now, that's another mathematical statement. It's one that has fewer solutions than the equation that they pick out. And once we include that additional assumption, we're now supposed to say that it's no longer mathematical possibility we're talking about, it's metaphysical possibility.
Yeah, I mean, if it's a metaphysical truth that, there can't be negative people, right?
Yeah.
Then you could add that in and derive a truth in the metaphysical modality that, well, assuming that the initial model was a matter of logic or metaphysics, that there'd be 2 people carrying the computer home rather than negative 2.
Yeah,
it's quite hard to see the detail of this, isn't it? Because give me classical logic, let's say first order predicate logic. Also give me the axioms of piano arithmetic, so I can say something like the quadratic equation that we've got, right, in principle.
Mm-hmm.
So suppose I could formulate all of that, and then I say, well, there's two solutions to this equation. What do I do? Now allow me another axiom, which is like whatever you want, something like there are no negative people, right? There are only positive numbers of people or something. That's fine. That sort of gets me a bit, but mathematically speaking, -2 is a solution, right? So I have to interpret the mathematics in some specific way. So it's like, even though -2 sometimes can be the solution, if I interpret the objects that the quantifiers are ranging over to be people, and that the additional axiom we put in that there can't be negative people applies to the things in that domain, something like that, then, I guess broadly speaking, we can go there, but it's quite complicated when you start thinking it through in any detail. It's just a confusing start, basically.
Yeah. And as what they say at the end of this paragraph, and I don't think they should say this, I think their case would be a bit better if they tried to keep it on the level of metaphysical possibility. But as they say at the end of this paragraph, no, they really think they're going to drive a logical impossibility.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's quite a strong claim.
Right. So they say, we shall also show that our new Hilbert argument entails a logical contradiction of the concrete world rather than, as Craig says, really a metaphysical impossibility. So whereas the -2 people bit was supposed to be a metaphysical impossibility, what they want this argument to establish is stronger than that. Right? That's the claim, is that it's not what's going on in that mathematical case. It's something. It's instead a logical impossibility. So yeah.
So
Yeah, and not only is it a logical impossibility to have a Hilbert's Hotel, but it's going to be a logical impossibility to have for past-eternalism to be true, as a consequence of that on their argument.
Right.
So
That's right.
and that just seems much too strong of a conclusion to support.
I just think it's an abuse of the term logical impossibility to say that, right? Like if I say something like, just like some humdrum contradiction, like I'm going to the shop and I'm not going to the shop, right? Like it's a logical contradiction in the sense that, like, uninterpreted, that P and not P is provable. Not P and not P is provable in classical logic, right? So that its negation is impossible in that logical sense. Fine. If I start interpreting it as, in particular, it's about some action that takes place in the concrete world, right? It's not that you've established a logical contradiction in the concrete world, which is what they're saying here. It's just that any formula of that shape, of just that form, is false in virtue of its form. That's it. It's not about in the concrete world or not. So like a logical contradiction has to be agnostic about the interpretation of the non-logical constants, right? It's just, it doesn't care about that. If it's a logical contradiction, the reason it's stronger in the kind of like, in some senses, the broadest modalities, because it's not interested in the specifics of what's going on. So it's sort of an abuse of language to say it's a logical contradiction, but it only applies to this domain of things, the domain of concretely existing things. So anyway, it's a sort of nitpicky, but
no, that's a good point. I don't know what this in the concrete world is adding. If it's a logical contradiction, it's a logical contradiction full stop, right? I don't know.
Exactly. Well, what's going on is that it's just that we've been saying for ages, for years, and me and Dan have had this conversation millions of times, but many times in the last sort of 10 years or so, which is that, like, Craig's Hilbert's Hotel argument doesn't have a contradiction involved. It just shows that the behavior is weird. And Locke doesn't want us to be able to say that. Sorry, say that again?
And he admits that, right? Craig admits that.
Yeah, exactly. So Locke wants to be able to do something better than that, basically. He wants us to not be able to say, well, this is just weird, but it's not contradictory. He wants to say, no, it is a contradiction. So, just forestalling that. That's all it is. And he's just using the wrong terminology to say that.
And I think this is a really important point that it may not be obvious to all of our viewers. When we talk about the metaphysically possible, we're talking about a really broad range of possibilities, many of which will seem very, very strange. So the example that I gave in my dissertation was that it's metaphysically possible for there to be a galaxy-sized hippopotamus singing the Star-Spangled Banner, and that's metaphysically possible. Why not an infinitely large hotel, right? I mean, that's part of the challenge here, is that it better not just be that it's weird, because many things that are metaphysically possible, given how broad a range of possibility is, we're talking about the metaphysically possible, there's going to be many things that are metaphysically possible that are very, very strange.
Yeah. That's right. There's that Proust quip about, like, a platypus is strange, right? But it doesn't mean it's metaphysically impossible.
Right.
Strangeness obviously just isn't in that sort of a criteria. Anyway, okay, let's keep going into the actual content of what we're dealing with there. So we've got, I think, so he's saying we've got this distinction. We're going to do a logical contradiction, right? And then let's get on to the new Hilbert's Hotel argument. So, yeah, go on.
Yeah. I'll just start with the initial setup. So we start with the Hilbert's Hotel as before, with the infinitely many rooms and an infinite number of guests, each occupying one room. And we note that each room can only occupy one guest at a time. And there's sort of one extra addition to this setup, which is that each room also has one meal in it. And each meal in a room could only be eaten by the guest in that room if they check into the room. So I don't know if this is going to be relevant, but they number the rooms and guests, and they might as well number the meals as well, through all the natural numbers as so. And the thought is, and there's this notion of an extra meal, which is, and this will definitely come up because it's a little bit strange, where they say an extra meal is defined as a meal or meals that are available for guests to collect and eat again after all the guests have eaten their meals, resulting in each guest having more material in their body and her body the next day. So, like, you could imagine that each of the guests check in the first day, eat a meal, and do something such that the next day there's more meals, or that there are meals left over at least for them to each eat and have more stuff in their body. But yeah, I don't know if anyone wants to comment on that already.
I mean, this is one of the main parts of the paper, it seems to me. This definition of extra really does all the heavy lifting. So it's hard to not spend ages talking about it. Let's just start with a couple of things that are quite strange about this as a definition. The word extra is what's put in quotes, as if that's the term that's being given the definition. But if you think about it, extra is defined as, I guess you could substitute, just think of the word equals or if and only if or something. Extra, if and only if. And then the actual thing we've been given as the definition is meals that are available for the guests to collect, blah, blah, blah. I mean, clearly the term extra doesn't only refer to meals, right? You'd think if what we're talking about is the word extra, that it should be explicable in completely abstract terms, like it's two sets and it's like the difference between them or something. That's what we mean by extra. I don't know. It's just weird that the definition of this is given strictly in terms of like guests and hotel rooms and meals and stuff. Presumably, we just have to see through that, and we're supposed to grasp the general concept that's being given, not really a definition, but kind of characterizing instance, right? So we're supposed to sort of spot what the pattern is. So what's going on? I mean, it's defined as meals that are available for the guests to collect and eat again. Unnecessary use of the word again. I mean, nothing's eaten again. If you've eaten a meal, You can't eat it again, presumably, but they mean eat again, as in I can have another meal or something, after all the guests have already eaten their meals. So like, if I check into my hotel room and there's a little, like, say, plate with some food on it or something, if I just go to sleep and don't eat it, that doesn't count as an extra meal because not all of the guests have eaten. Like, I'm the guest that hasn't eaten. So even though it's still there the following day, that doesn't count as extra, strictly speaking. I mean, that's what the definition says. It's meals that are ready to collect again after all the guests have already eaten their meals. So that scenario I just gave doesn't characterize this notion of extra. So it's already a bit weird, isn't it, if you think about it? Like, what general concept are we supposed to be picking out? The concept, it seems to me, it requires not only that the meal is left over the next day, but that every guest ate a meal that they had the opportunity to, right? So struggling to see a general concept here. I think it's really just a kind of particularist concept that only applies to the Hilbert hotel case, and it doesn't really, struggling to see how I could apply that in another setting. This definition of extra is like hyper idiosyncratic or something that can only be used in this one context.
Two things quickly. That's a good point. That they really should have been defining extra meals rather than extra. That just seems like a weird thing to say there. But the other thing I'm wondering, and we could talk about this more, couldn't you talk about there being extra rooms? What is the extra meals adding that we didn't already have with extra rooms? And I know you brought up a similar point when you wrote a blog post about this initially. So I don't know if you wanted to say more about that. Like, why?
Well, yeah, I think that really what we'll see is, I think if we can relax very slightly the notion of extra so that it's not so hyper idiosyncratic, I think it's reasonable to say that there could be extra hotel rooms in the same way. Like a hotel room that's extra just means something like every guest is checked into a hotel room, and there are some hotel rooms that don't have any guests in, right? And if that's reasonable, with deviating very slightly from the exact wording on the page, but I think it's charitable to do that because it makes the concept more robust. I think if we do that, then it also makes sense to talk about extra guests, right? Which is that, like, maybe every hotel room has a guest in it. And if there are still some guests waiting around to be shown to their room, they're extra guests because they don't have a room, kind of thing. So you got extra meals, extra rooms, extra guests. And all it means really is every of the other type of things already matched up with something and it's left over. It's like if I match together all the knives and forks in my cutlery drawer and there's a fork left over, that's extra. That's all it means, I think. And I think that that's charitable and fair, even though it's slightly different to what I think.
This is where I have a really hard time understanding this paper, because it's not obvious to me what the meals add, because
Right.
if this is supposed to be an advance on the dialectic, which any publication is supposed to do, then there should be something here that's original and that hasn't already been said in the literature, some point that hasn't already been responded to. Now, I guess no one has put this difficulty in terms of meals before, but it seems to me that someone could just say something like, oh, well, the group of guests don't have the causal power to make extra rooms. And of course, by like extra rooms, we just mean empty rooms, rooms that are empty after we've already checked all the guests into all of their rooms. It seems to me that the only role that the meals are playing in this argument is that for each of the rooms that's not occupied, there's a meal in it, right? So all the meals really do is keep track of how many empty rooms we're left with after we shuffle the guests around.
Yeah, that's right.
But the someone who thinks that Hilbert's Hotel is possible, they've already said that, yeah, this might be an absurd feature of Hilbert's Hotel, that you can move the guests around in such a way that you're left with empty rooms. But they bite the bullet and they say that's not a problem after all. And so I guess, in terms of this argument, you might ask where someone should press on it, like which of the premises one ought to object to.
Well, to be fair, we haven't actually looked at the argument yet, so maybe that's jumping ahead a little bit. We should show the argument and then start wondering which premise we might doubt.
Okay, fair enough. Let's take a look at the premises then.
Just one more quick comment there. Yeah, it just seems obvious to me that the meals, that doesn't really add anything in itself. What they're going to add is the causal principle and the further argument. But that seems to me that could have been made without adding in the meals. They could just talk about there being extra rooms, or extra unturned doorknobs, or it doesn't, like, the meals just don't really make any difference in themselves. It's if there's anything novel here, it's the further sort of causal principle. But that could have been applied to the standard Hilbert's Hotel case, without adding the meals, it seems to me. So, but yeah, I guess we can get to the
so let's throw it up on the screen then. Is there any way you can zoom in a bit so that can be more prominent to?
Guess I can do it.
Oh, is it going to kind of try and resize and be okay? Yeah, that's great. Cool. All right.
There we go.
So this is an argument in the sense that we've got numbered premises, and we are told at least which premises the inferences rely on, although not the inference rules that they used in the derivation, which is sort of half what you'd expect in that sense. All right, let's just go through it. We've got at some point someone's got to try and read this out. So the first premise is necessarily the causal power of a group of X, where X equals an action, close brackets, for causing extra Y depends on X having the relevant causal power to cause extra Y. The causal power of a group of actions for causing extra stuff depends on the actions having the relevant power to cause the extra stuff. And do you have any direct comment on this premise as we read it?
Maybe we should go through all the premises and then respond to the arguments.
Okay.
Yeah.
So then the second premise, necessarily, if X has no relevant causal power for causing extra Y, then an infinite number of X would have no relevant causal power for causing extra Y. And we're told that follows from the first premise. Again, not given an inference rule that would tell you how we've got to that. Do we think that's a valid inference? I'm struggling, to be honest, to see how that follows.
Yeah, I mean, I wanted to bring up that I don't think that's, I don't buy that inference. And at any rate, I think Loken Haytov's interlocutors, people who think that infinite collections are possible, have reason to reject that premise. I mean, this is an issue that goes back a long way in the literature. That even if you could have an infinite collection where each member of the infinite collection is causally impotent for what results, and yet the whole collection has a causal power to produce some result. Now, Loke and Hightoft might not agree that that's possible, but that's a position that people who endorse the possibility of infinite collections have widely adopted historically. And so if Loke and Hightoft are going to make some point against their interlocutors, they shouldn't neglect what has been historically one of the major views on offer by people who think that the infinite is metaphysically possible.
So do you have some view, like the thought is that that an atom doesn't have the ability to smash a window, but like when I throw a cricket ball at a window, which is nothing more than just a bunch of atoms, right? And it's just some kind of amalgamation of their causal power, then it does have that. And somehow the power has emerged out of some stuff that didn't have power individually or something.
So that's one way that one could go. But actually, when we talk about the infinite, there's a stronger view that has been offered historically. So there's this. So as one example, there's a Benedetti. Did I say that correctly? Is it Benedetti?
Benedetti, yeah.
Yeah, but there's a Benedetti paradox where it's a version of the Grim Reaper paradox where we imagine is that over the span of some distance through space, I don't know, through 5 feet or something, if, for the last half of that foot, say, or the last foot or whatever, there's a Grim Reaper that intends to kill, say, Bob if he journeys into that one. And likewise, for an interval of diminishing size, so at the rest of the distance, there's a corresponding Grim Reaper, such that there's no first Grim Reaper. Now, Bob can't go through those, say, 5 feet, because if he did so, then it's certain that some Grim Reaper would kill him. But since there's no first Grim Reaper, it can't be that anyone in particular does kill him. And even worse, since the Grim Reapers in that series, each of them only intends to kill Bob and doesn't in fact take concrete action to do so, their intending to do so is causally impotent with respect to killing Bob, right? In the same way that like dreams are, for example, right? And one of the examples that Loke and Hightoft give in their article is that a dream is causally impotent for bringing about a meal. Well, likewise, intending to kill someone, merely intending and not carrying out any concrete actions to do so, is causally impotent in their death. And yet this infinite series of causally impotent Reapers, I mean, either they're going to prevent Bob from advancing into that interval at all, or Bob ends up dead, whatever it is, something happens to Bob that each Reaper is individually causally impotent to bring about, and yet the entire collection of them has the causal power to bring about. Now, because that's an infinitary paradox, Loke and Hightoft may well say, "Oh, well, that example is also impossible for a similar reason that Hilbert hotels are impossible." But the point here isn't that they ought to accept that case is possible. It's just that people who have advanced cases like that have this view that you could have an infinite collection where every member of the collection is causally impotent for what the entire collection brings about. And the entire collection is bring it about because even though every member is causally impotent, the collection as a whole is not.
Right. So there are people who deny that principle, basically.
Yeah, there's people who deny premise two. And the no mention is made in this article of people that deny premise two.
Right. Yeah. So just quickly, I want to add a few things there, but just on whether two follows from one, I think that's fine so long as we understand depends as being implying an entailment there. So if you just took the contrapositive from premise one, and then just you get that if X has no relevant causal power for causing extra Y, then a group of X would have no relevant causal power for causing extra Y, and then 1.2 sort of straightforwardly follows from that the infinite group is just a sort of group.
I see, right.
And that seems fine to me. But of course, sorry, go ahead.
No, I interrupted you, Karen.
Well, I was going to say, as what Dan was getting at, you might still have reason to reject 1.2 and by extension then 1.1, but I'm just commenting on the consequence of 1.2 from 1.1.
Yeah, I think so. What I had in mind, and maybe this brings out an important issue about the first premise. So I took premise 1 to be a statement about a finite group of X.
No, it's meant to be just any group. Finite
okay, so if it's meant to be any group, then the fact that there are people who would deny 1.2 means that they should also deny 1.1. But down below, when they justify, so below argument where they offer argument 1, there's this paragraph where they describe why we should accept 1.1. And there the argument they say later this isn't what they do, but I think it's clear that what they do here is that they consider some finite cases and they generalize to include the infinite case.
Yeah, that's right. I think that they are trying to give you, plausibly, at least, they're trying to give you an intuition pump. So you're more likely to nod along to the humdrum case, I suppose. But I think Troy's right that the best way to understand premise 1 is to say and the inference from 1 to 2 is something like an instantiation, right? So you've got something where maybe the right way to think about premise 1 is there's some kind of quantifier that's saying something like for all sizes of group, right? For collections of any size.
Or for any group, yeah.
For any, exactly. Group of quantifying universally over the entire range of groups that you could have. And then this premise 2 is simply saying, so therefore for this specific size of group, as in an infinitely big one, given that we've quantified over all sizes of groups, this is an instantiation. So it's like saying, if every man is called Jim, then this man is called Jim. It's just a kind of an instantiation thing, in which case, fine, that I can understand. That's why you need to state the inference rule when you say which premise follows from what. Anyway, okay, so cool.
It wouldn't be so difficult for him to give a even simple logical representation of the argument, because they do that later on for the further arguments. So I don't know. It wouldn't be too difficult to do that here, but regardless. Just quickly though, did we want to comment on in premise 1 where they refer to X as an action, where they speak of actions having the causal powers? I don't know if that seems a little bit strange, but I don't know if we want to comment on that.
Yeah, I think it's sort of strange in a way that's that's not how people normally talk about this. On the other hand, it's kind of odd, but I'm not sure that there's any real reason that you can't talk about it like that. My understanding of it is that normally in the sort of causation philosophy literature, it's basically you've got people who want to talk about events being the bearers of causal relations, right? Or you might want to talk about people being objects, and Aristotle causes the fire by rubbing the sticks together or something, right? You want to talk about people having been the bearers of causal powers or something. Sometimes I think Hugh Mellor wanted to talk about facts being causes or something, right? I don't know, maybe there are other candidates as well. I've just never personally come across anyone talking about actions being the bearers of causal power. Have either of you?
No. If anything, I would think of the action as part of the exercise of some causal power, not a thing itself which has some causal power in its own right. But I'm not sure it really is going to matter that much. But yeah, sorry, go down.
Well, so I think maybe the more general point to flag here is that the way that this paper has been constructed assumes a particular metaphysics about causal powers and so on, and not all philosophers are going to accept that metaphysics. So ordinarily, the way that I have seen causal powers talked about is that substances, that could be people could be substances. The substances are the things that are the bearers of causal power. And then other people want to talk about events and, for example, whether there are necessitation relations between events, or for someone like Lewis, there's not going to be powers per se, and there's not going to be necessitation relations per se either. Fundamentally for Lewis, there's just the distribution of natural qualities across the Humean mosaic. So one way that this paper might be going off the rails is that it is assuming, even if people do talk about actions having causal powers, it's not going to be every philosopher that would agree to that framing.
Yeah. That's right. Which is okay, because you never make an argument that every philosopher signs up to, but it would be nice to signpost a bit more clearly. In this paper, we're assuming a such and such view of causal whatever, and just flag that as so that if you're a Humean about causation or something, you just realize, well, this isn't for me. It doesn't really matter if I disagree with that premise, because it's for whatever Aristotelians about cause. But there's no signposting. Right?
Yeah, and perhaps their argument could be rephrased so as to not take this sort of stand on what things have causal powers. Maybe the group of X could be things that have some causal power, and then you could still make the same argument, perhaps.
Yeah, I think it's natural. Yeah. I think it's natural to say that the guests don't have this causal power, right? I mean, I think you're exactly right. You could reframe this to be in terms of kind of an Aristotelian view, where we have substances, and then those substances have causal powers, and the substances we're interested in are the guests. They don't have the causal power to bring about extra meals or extra rooms or whatever. I think, if nothing else, I think the paper would have been easier for me to understand if it had been framed that way.
Right. Yeah. At least give us a sort of footnote that says something like, maybe some people might not sign on to this view about causal powers, but note that we could rephrase it in terms of that's amenable to other views, and that I think will go a bit of ways in making it more accessible.
That's true.
It's something we already talked about, but I do really want to press here. When three of the statements here have necessarily at the beginning, and recall the relevant modality is supposed to be logic, and
yeah,
it just strikes me as patently obvious that none of these are truth of logic. So we can talk more about this, but why think that the denial of one here it requires committing to some sort of logical impossibility? It just seems straightforwardly that it does not. If it is true, that's maybe a true principle about causation. Maybe you can argue that it's a metaphysical necessity. I wouldn't accept that, but maybe you could argue that. But it just seems like a complete non-starter to me to argue that it's a matter of logic. And their conclusion rests on it being a matter of logic. So that just seems
right.
It seems dead in the water.
Well, it seems to me that the modality here should be the same as when they talk about the impossibility of -2 people. Right. And if that was supposed to be a metaphysical impossibility, why isn't it a metaphysical impossibility for someone to violate this, like the necessitation claims in 1 and 2? It seems to me that it has exactly the same status.
Yeah, so I think that being charitable, right? There's no need. When I think that they say logical possibility in the first place, they don't actually mean logical possibility as in derivable directly from classical logic on its own.
No, but he does.
Look, the reason I think he has to mean something, I mean, Troy has spent much more time talking to him than I have about this, but again, there's this example about the -2 people, and he says that that's a metaphysical impossibility, and then he contrasts that. He says that the new HHA entails a logical contradiction in the concrete world rather than merely a metaphysical impossibility. He adds that whatever entails a logical contradiction would be metaphysically impossible as well, right? So his view of modality here is one where logical possibility is the broader thing, and then metaphysical possibility is more like everything that's metaphysically possible is also logically possible. But it's, that paragraph just directly says that he thinks that these things are distinct.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, but there's problems. I mean, we talked about the example of metaphysical impossibility, where it's the -2 people carrying the thing home. But before that, they quote Locke, saying Locke notes that while it's mathematically impossible, that what is mathematically impossible is metaphysically impossible, and in open brackets, e.g., it's impossible that 0 times 0 be anything other than 0. It's just that, what do you mean by impossible in that explanation? You just mean mathematically impossible, because if so, you haven't explained anything. What I think this is a fundamental misunderstanding is that, what mathematical impossibility means is enriching logical possibility with some axioms that characterize the mathematics in question, like Peano axioms or whatever, if you're doing arithmetic. So I just think that they don't understand that it's still going to be logic plus some other stuff. And you're still going to be deriving a contradiction in the same way. It's just new axioms giving you a restricted range of what's possible, right? And that whole picture is missing from that view.
But let's just grant that, for sake of discussion, that logic sees the relevant mathematical axioms, or maybe some sort of logicism is true, whatever. Even then, right? Suppose that mathematical truths are logically necessary.
Right.
Why would this be logically necessary? And what I got from Locke in my ensuing discussion with him was essentially that, look, premise one here, that the claim about products of sets, like Cartesian products of sets, is a correct model of causal powers of necessity. And denying premise one requires denying that the Cartesian product of an infinite set with an empty set, or of any set with the empty set, is the empty set. And that's a mathematical impossibility, and so a logical impossibility. And so he thinks that premise one is therefore logically necessary.
I think we should maybe I'll explain that for our audience. Yeah. So after giving argument one here, he then goes on to try to justify each of the premises in that argument. Right. So right there in that paragraph. And what he does here is he claims that the way to understand powers is that you multiply the result of each action by the number of actions. So, for example, he says, if you have 10 guests and each guest produces one extra meal, then 10 times 1 equals 10, so you get 10 meals. The group as a whole has the power to produce 10 meals. If you have 20 guests instead, and suppose that each guest produces 2 meals, then it's going to be 20 times 2, so 40 extra meals, and so on and so forth. Then he says, well, look, if you have an infinite number of guests, each one of which makes an extra meal, it's going to be infinity times 1, so you get infinity. And then in the paragraph after that, he's making this point about, so if you have a finite number of guests and a finite number of rooms in the hotel. So suppose you have 5 guests and 5 rooms in the hotel, then there's not going to be any rooms left empty after we fill each room with a guest. And so since there's only 1 meal per room, they take up they eat all the meals, and there's no meals left, right? So this is supposed to show us that the result of each action is that the corresponding meal is taken away. And then they say, okay, well, look, if you have an infinite number of guests and an infinite number of rooms, then since each meal is eaten by a guest, even in the infinite case, the guests don't have the causal power to bring about any leftover meals. And he tries to put this, or I don't know whether it's Locke or Hightower that came up with this idea, but they try to put this in terms of Cartesian products. So if you don't know what a Cartesian, okay, so if you don't know what a Cartesian product is, maybe some of our viewers don't, it's just where you take, so it's a way of multiplying together sets where you take combination of elements from the two sets that you're combining together. So for example, if I want to create the set of coordinates on an XY plane, then I can take the Cartesian product of the real numbers with themselves, right? Every coordinate has 2 numbers, an X value and a Y value. Each of those pairings, the collection of all those pairings that you can make is the Cartesian product of each of those set of numbers, the set of X numbers and the set of Y numbers. You take their Cartesian product, you get all of the pairs. Now, if I try to do a Cartesian product of the empty set, a set that has no guests, with any other collection, doesn't matter what collection I do this with any other collection, then I get an empty set, right? The number of pairings between a set that has no members and a set that has members is just a set with no members. Now, if he's right about the way to understand powers, that we're supposed to understand powers in terms of Cartesian products, then if each guest is causally impotent, then all the infinite number of them taken together is causally impotent. Now, there's sort of two strange things I think we can pick up on right away here. One of them is that when we talked about the finite case, we were multiplying numbers together, we were not actually taking Cartesian products. Another thing that's sort of strange here is that when we do turn to the Cartesian products, or actually even before when we weren't doing Cartesian products in the finite case, in either case, it's unclear that this is the right way to model powers. Why should I think about the powers of a collection in terms of this multiplication business? There's no argument here for that.
Yeah.
And I don't know why I should accept that.
Yeah, that it struck me as sort of insane for. Well, it still strikes me as kind of insane, but there's a sort of charitable reading that I got out of my ensuing discussion with him, where, okay, let's take the first set is going to be just the set containing all of the X's in the group, right? The collection of actions or whatever. The second set contains, in some sense, what each of them is able to do individually, like what the causal power of an individual one. So in some of these analogies that he gives here is like, suppose I guess each guest is able to cook one meal. The second set would be a set containing one meal, because that's the causal power of each guest or each guest's actions. And then the thought is that the Cartesian product of those two sets represents, in a way, what the group is together able to produce. Now, of course, that Cartesian product is going to be a series of ordered pairs, where it's going to be like guest 1, one meal, guest 2, one meal, guest 3, one meal. But the idea is that, like, well, suppose you had 5 guests, well, then you have, up to guest 5, one meal. And in a way, that resultant set, you have 5 meals that are produced, right, and or modeled by that. It's still maybe not clear and sort of strange, and I think the definition of that second set is problematic, but this is sort of how I understood it, as the sort of most charitable version of this model, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I'm inclined to think that it's just an informal idea, and there's been the sort of hand waving it is like a bit like mathematical formulae of different types and stuff, but none of them really get what they're saying properly. And it really, the intuitive idea is just supposed to be something like, there's this thing that Dan was saying that they don't really argue for, which is, I guess, what premise 1 is saying, which is just that, like, if a group can do something, then that ability is sort of composed of the individual contributions towards that ability that the individuals in that group provide to the group. Now, we don't need, I think that's good enough to say. I mean, you don't really need, nothing actually relies on the numbers in particular, right? Apart from if it's 0. So it's just any numbers, timesing one number by another number gives you just numbers as normal arithmetic would tell you. So it's not that informative. The point is just, if none of the things have any causal power, then together they also should have no causal power. And I think there's nothing else apart from sheer intuition going into that. You just can't understand how it could be that a group of things could do something if none of the individual things even contributed any sort of causal power towards it. And exactly what mathematics they're trying to use there, I think, doesn't matter, right? They could have dropped all of that talk about the Cartesian products and still just made the point in the same way, right? So it is incidental to the argument. Is that right?
Yeah, I think it is, but I don't know. I think if my thinking is that the reason they appeal to this sort of mathematics is that, I mean, it helps make them make the case that this is a matter of necessity. Because if you're just appealing to some sort of intuition or something like that, well, maybe it might be intuitive, but not necessary in the logical sense. But if it's a matter of mathematics, right, that this,
Yeah.
But of course, leaving aside whether the mathematics is itself a matter of logic, is still a further question. Well, is it a matter of mathematics or logic that this model is a correct model of this scenario? And that seems to me obviously not the case. I mean, you might think it's a correct model, but it's not a matter of logic that it be so.
That's right. So I think this is a really important point. In fact, I've mentioned this example before, where there are people who have argued in the literature, like Benedetti, that a collection could actually have a causal power that none of the members partially contribute to. I think there's another piece of pre-existing literature that's important to bring out here, and that's Grumbach's famous solution to Zeno's paradox of measure. So what's going on with that case is that Zeno presents, or at least it's attributed to Zeno, that there's this problem about continua. So if you imagine like a length that's composed of infinitely small points, well then, if each of there's two possibilities in the way that we can think about the relationship between each of the points and the entire length. Either each of the points contributes some non-zero length to the whole thing, in which case we'd actually get that it's infinitely long and not finitely long, right? Which is the wrong answer for any like line segment. Or each of the points contributes zero distance to the whole, and then we would get that the whole thing has a length of zero, which is also the wrong answer. Grumbach points out that there's a bit of mathematics from a branch of mathematics called measure theory that is the right formal apparatus for describing this case. And when you describe everything mathematically properly, then you don't get zero for the total, even though each point contributes a length of zero. Now we don't have to go through all the mathematics he presents in that article, but the point is just that this is another bit of the pre-existing literature that he didn't bother to cite, that I'm not sure as far as this article is concerned, because they didn't cite it, I'm not sure that they're even aware of it. Other people who write about the Kalam argument are aware of it, because Craig cites that article. So I don't know. I don't know what to say there, because it's just, that's another case where we could think about there being some totality that has some property where each of the members contributes zero to that totality, and that people who defend the infinite accept it there, and so we therefore would have a reason to reject both premises 1 and 2.
Yeah, I mean, just like plainly, I'll let you go in second else. I mean, we'll discuss some more counterexamples, because I to premise 1 and 2, because it came up in my discussion with him. But it just seems kind of plain that even if, like, think in this Hilbert Hotel case, maybe there are certain things that can be produced only by the group acting and coordinating a certain way that none of the members individually can do. That just seems perfectly sensible. And if you're sort of on board with thinking that Hilbert Hotel like this is possible in the first place, then we should think that they could rearrange themselves in this way, and that would satisfy there being extra meals. And if that possibility requires denying the premise 1 here and 2, then so much for premise 1 and 2. It seems more plain to me anyway that sort of rearranging is possible than that this principle, which would rule out that sort of rearranging or scenario in the first place, is correct. But that's sort of high level where it sort of just right off the bat just goes wrong for me. But I don't know, you could talk more about that.
I think that's right. I'm very sympathetic to that. And I think that ultimately there is going to be some kind of trade that you could make where you go, I'm going to bite the bullet and deny that premise or whatever. And it would be, I think it would just turn into a kind of Moorian shift where you can just sort of start with a different premise and deny the other thing and whatever. I think just for the purposes of like time, because, but we still haven't even covered all the premises of the first argument. Okay. So let me try and speak them out loud anyway. So 1.1, without saying it out loud, it means groups don't have causal powers to do stuff that the individual members of that group don't contribute to. Second one is saying, therefore, a group with infinitely many people none of whom contribute towards that power, also wouldn't have any power. Then so we've done those two already. 1.3 then is a kind of instance of the type of thing that number one was talking about, because it's basically saying a group of size 1, as in a specific individual guest checking into one room, has no causal power. And that just means it's a group. Therefore, 1.2 basically says you can generalize to, well, I suppose 1.1 is saying it's groups of any type. So if you've got a group of size 1, we're allowed to say, therefore, necessarily an infinite number of guests, if they also have no relevant causal power collectively, that don't do either. And so it's basically just trying to say, using that causal principle to suppose that because an individual person doesn't have the power to cause an extra meal, you can somehow generalize it out to all of the infinite, to a collection that had infinitely many people. And anyway, it's my best gloss at trying to say the argument and not prejudge anything. But I do want to talk about the motivation for premise 1.1 that comes up in this next paragraph. Because I was thinking about this earlier today, and I started doubting whether or not this even counts as an example of somebody that has the power to cause extra Y, right? So the problem, I guess, goes back to the combination of the definition of extra that we looked at already and the fact that what we're talking about is a group of actions. So let's just try and explain my worry, right? So consider a hotel with only 2 guests, one of whom, instead of checking into one room rather than the other, cooks a meal for the day, for the next day. This action has the causal power to cause extra meals for the next day. So right there, I think what cooking a meal, a new meal from basic ingredients or whatever, plausibly makes a meal that didn't exist beforehand begin to exist, right? Makes a new thing. And the word extra is quite close, sort of, in meaning to new. So if I cause an extra meal or cause a new meal, you can kind of like forgive the reader for not noticing there's any difference between them. But of course, if we go back to the definition, thanks for scrolling up. So extra is given a specific definition here. It means that it's available after all the other guests have eaten their meals, right? So I can cook a meal and it's a new meal that didn't exist before, but whether it's extra or not isn't determined simply by me making it, right? It's extra only if, according to this definition, all of the other guests, it's still there after everyone's had their meal, right? So if I cook a meal now and everybody eats other meals and nobody eats my meal, then it's extra, so long as everybody's eaten, right? Then it's extra at that point. It wasn't extra when I made it. It's being extra relies on everybody else playing their part too. And until we specify what everybody else does, there's no way of saying whether this meal is extra or not. So on its own, it's an example of somebody doing something that's sort of neither extra or not extra. It's sort of like, it could go on to become extra, it could go on to not become extra, but you can't just say on its own. Rather, it's like saying, I've got a son. Okay, so does that mean he's going to grow up to be the prime minister? Well, it doesn't mean that. Does it mean he's going to grow up to be something else? Doesn't mean that either. You just don't know yet. It's just a son. You could do anything. Here, they make a meal. It could be extra, or it could not be. So it's like not even the thing that he's giving or they're giving to motivate premise 1 just doesn't count as an example of that. It's just not an example of somebody making anything extra in their sense. Right?
Yeah, this is something I had not thought of, but it sounds right to me, which is that, as you say, so even if we consider a finite case that where they cook a meal, whether that's extra is not a matter of, or at least merely of, the direct causal power of the guest that cooks the meal, because whether it counts as extra depends on, in part, on what all the other guests do, right? And as it came out of my discussion with him, I actually got some qualifiers about what the sort of causal powers were and the relevant causal power is as it relates in premise 1 and 2 and so on. And it importantly was restricted to direct causal power to produce some effect or part of that effect, right? So in other words, in order for a group to have the direct causal power to produce an extra meal or part of an extra meal, then at least some of the members of that group have to be able to have the direct causal power to produce an extra meal or part of an extra meal. And if what you're saying here is right, and it seems right to me, that even in this finite case where he thinks that the group has the causal power to produce extra meals because one of the members cooked a meal, that it's not right that the individual members have causal power to cook the extra meal, to produce an extra meal, because the guest cooking a meal is not directly causing extra meals. Whether it's an extra meal depends on further facts, not under their immediate control.
That's right. And that's,
yeah.
Sorry, I interrupted.
I was going to say this just quickly. This might call into question certain more general questions about causation and direct causal power, like when does an enabling condition undermine the directness of a causal influence, blah, 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 stuff like that. But it seems right to me anyway, without getting into those details, which maybe we'll get into, that the activity here, the direct causal activity of that guest is cooking a meal, not causing an extra meal.
Yeah.
But anyway. Right. Yeah.
And I think that the penny drop is that when you realize, given the definition of extra, that sort of, as I was saying before, the hyper idiosyncratic idea that it's a meal and it's still there after everyone else has had a meal. And I mean, what it does is it relates the action of a specific person, like picking a hotel room or cooking a meal or something, directly out. It's like an extrinsic relation. It's like being to the left of something. You can't, it doesn't make any sense to be to the left of something without specifying where the other thing is, right? You've just not said all the things you need to. And here, if we just say somebody cooks a meal, is it extra? You just don't know, because you have to also say whether or not everyone else is going to eat other meals and whether that one will be left over afterwards and something. So it's sort of like, by definition, an individual action couldn't provide a contribution towards this thing, because the definition of what it means involves sort of intrinsically part of it reference to other things beyond that one individual agent. So like that, I think that to me is what it has a lot of expansion power in diagnosing the issue with this argument. Like, how come it seems like each person can't contribute to it, but the group can? Well, that's explicable, at least partly, in terms of the weird gerrymandered property of extra that we're talking about, which explicitly references other people. So that's I think what's part of, at least what's generating the confusion here.
Yeah, I agree. Dan, did you want to add anything on that, or because I wanted to bring up another? Yeah, sorry.
Well, I think that sounds exactly right. I mean, that's what Alex just said is, I think, incredibly helpful, because it explains why it is that principles like the first premise here, are objectionable if they are taken to range over infinite collections.
Well,
right. I mean,
but even under finite collections, it seems like objectionable. Yeah.
Exactly right. Because like, if you think about it in the finite case, suppose there's 3 hotel rooms, each one with a meal in, and there's 2 guests.
Mm-hmm.
And guest 1 picks room 1 and guest 2 picks room 2. So room 3's got a meal that's not eaten in it, right? Well, then that means that guest 1, I suppose, kind of causally contributed, or however Luke wants to put it, to there being an extra meal. But suppose then they pick different rooms, right? So guest 1 goes in room 2 and guest 2 goes in room 3, and it leaves room 1 open. Well, same thing. They've generated an extra meal again. They've causally, whatever, had their power to cause this extra meal. And actually, it doesn't matter which action they do. Any of the range of rooms that they pick is going to guarantee to cause an extra thing.
That's right, because the definition doesn't say anything about whether we're talking about a Hilbert hotel, for example. All it says is that it says extra is defined as meals that are available for the guest to collect and eat again after all the guests have already eaten their meals, resulting in each guest having more material in her body the next day. Right. So if you have a finite hotel with fewer guests than there are rooms or meals, then you're going to be left with extra meals, simply because of the number of guests that you've had.
Exactly. Exactly.
Yeah, that's right.
So then the action of picking a room in that case does have the causal power to generate extra meals, right? But then just change it so that now, instead of there being more rooms than guests, you've got more guests than rooms, right? So now, no matter how they pick rooms, it's bound to be bound to have all of the meals eaten. So there's definitely not going to be any extra meals, right? There couldn't be, no matter which store they pick. There's nothing they can do. They have no causal power. It contributes zero, blah, 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 right? But there's nothing interesting about causation here. It's just, are there more guests than meals? That's all that's going on. And it turns into this, like, in one sense, like, impossibility of causation. And in the other case, weirdly, although they never actually draw this out, a necessary consequence of any action that they do, that it makes extra meals. So I think the fact that even in the normal case, the finite case, that the way of talking is so strained and unusual, it sort of spits out these weird results of, like, I have this inescapable power to cause extra meals simply by opening a door. Something's gone wrong, right? It's just we're just talking about stuff wrong. Like, we're using the words in such a deviant way that it doesn't track the concepts as we, even in philosophy, normally take them to be. So I think it's probably going to be my overall interpretation. But okay. So after that, right? He says cooking the meals causes extra meals. I don't think it does. But then he contrasts it with, well, what about someone who, instead of cooking a meals, dreams about meals? And that doesn't contribute anything. So that's like when you don't have any causal power. And this is supposed to be an intuition pump to make you see somehow that this is about causation, I guess. It's hard to just sort of, like, charitably read that now we've given a really sort of detailed critique of it.
This just seems like an obviously hasty generalization here. That, like, look, here's a scenario where we agree that no matter how many guests engage in this activity, no extra meals will be produced. Okay. And it's true that them individually didn't produce any extra meals. So now we infer, in any case where there's a guest who individually doesn't produce any extra meals, any group of those guests could not produce any extra meals. That just seems like a straightforwardly hasty generalization. Maybe we can agree that that's so in the case of dreaming, right? That any amount of dreaming will not produce extra meals. But why? What about rearranging rooms in an Infinite Hilbert's hotel? I think that is a case where individually they wouldn't produce any extra meals. Although, depending on how that relevant causal power is construed, actually, we might even think that premise 3 is false, but maybe we'll get to that. But supposing that is correct, the group would nevertheless have that ability. I mean, so, like, I don't know. This just seems like a bit of a hasty generalization to me.
Yeah.
And it's not even that it's from the finite case to the infinite case. It's from a particular case where they're not able to produce extra meals to any case where individually they're not able to the group not being able to.
Am I allowed to be really pedantic as well?
Oh, yeah, sure.
Point. But just, if you notice the sentence in the middle of the paragraph that you've got highlighted that begins with open brackets, having no power, blah, blah, blah. If you notice the entire sentence is within the scope of the brackets, apart from the full stop, which is outside the scope of the brackets. But the way you're supposed to introduce brackets is that the thing around, if you remove the thing in the brackets, the sentence would still be grammatically correct, right? You wouldn't put clauses or something that you need for the sentence to be grammatically correct within a bracket. It's an addition that could be substituted. But in that case, that means that the full sentence is simply a full stop without any content whatsoever. And that's not a sentence, right? So there's, like, a couple of reasons why that's not very well. I mean, that's the sort of the reviewers should have pointed out. But just put the full stop within the scope of the brackets, and that's fine.
There's many examples. There's many examples like this. I mean, every time they put a sentence inside of brackets, they do that. And I mean, there's grammatical errors throughout the paper, but I don't know. I mean, I guess I'm a little bit less inclined to be too harsh on that front. I don't know much about Loke and Heitog's background. I have the impression that they're not native English speakers, and so perhaps that could explain some of those grammatical quirks.
Yeah, but just sympathetic to that. Just this sentence that I highlighted here, I really want to press on this a little bit, because this, like, seems to be just voicing their generalization here. I say the above example illustrates the point that if an action is causally relevant for causing extra y, then no matter how many such actions there are, they would still be causally relevant. But that one example of dreaming shows that for any x and y, why would that follow? Like,
well, and I think that's important to point out, because later on they make the claim that this first argument is not based on a generalization. And I think it's just clear from the way this is written that it is.
Yeah, they seem to be implying that this reveals some like in principle like logical truth or something like that about causation, and it doesn't reveal it to me. It's not clear that they've given any reason to think that, apart from just a couple of examples. I don't know.
Yeah, and I think there can't be any logical truths about causation apart from trivial ones, like either causation or non-causation, stuff like that. But there's nothing else you can say. You can't say by a matter of logic, the causal power of an agent only contributes to the group if blah, blah, blah. None of that is a matter of logic.
All right, do you want to move on to the second argument too?
Well, I wanted to just, if it's all right, could we bring up, unless we want to come back to this after, in the course of my discussion with him on the Facebook thread, I presented a variety of, I think, counterexamples to 1.1. And I wanted to bring up maybe just one of them, and we can discuss more if you want, but I wanted to bring up one that I thought was fairly simple. Like, and it works in the finite case too. So like, just imagine that there's a group of wizards, and well, we can set their actions be like casting a spell, right? And it turns out that there's a certain sort of spell that they can cast that individually produces nothing, but they sort of, if they do that as a group, the group spell produces some magical effect, so directly. And that sort of scenario seems entirely coherent, right? That you could imagine that there's some spells that only work by sort of combination of spell casting, where individually the spell does nothing, in a group they produce some magical effect directly. That seems entirely coherent to me. But if that's coherent, then that is a counterexample to premise one, because that's a case where you have the group having some relevant causal power, and you might even say that the effect is producing extra meals, whatever. But it doesn't matter, that they're producing extra of something. Where none of them individually have that power. They can produce an extra of that thing, or even part of an extra of that thing. So, I mean, what do you think about that? I mean, it just seems sort of straightforward to me as a counterexample.
Yeah, I think that's quite plausible. So I also had this idea of like in the seance or in the Ouija board or whatever, when everyone has to be holding hands, and if you break the circle, then whatever, something happens, but you have to all be doing it together in a circle of salt around the pentagram. So you can reach all these sort of fanciful examples, but yeah, there's probably more concrete. It's like this probably doesn't work, but I was thinking of it like a circuit of fairy lights or something where they all have to be working or none of them work or something. But I guess maybe that's reducible more straightforwardly to just some like linear sequence of things happening.
I mean, I think the problem with some of these examples, including the fairy light one, is that the intuition here, right, is supposed to be that either each of the X's contributes in some way to the causal power of the collective, in which case the collective could have the relevant causal power, or each of the members does nothing, right? It's impotent with respect to what comes about. And in that case, it's supposed to be that the collective just doesn't have the relevant causal power, right? So a counterexample to, at least to that intuition, would be a case where you have a collection of things that each one is causally impotent, but collectively there's the causal power. And so, this might be why, an individual atom can't break a window, but a collection of atoms can. Loken Heithoff might say, sure, what's going on in that case is that each of the atoms contributes some of its causal power to the entire brick that breaks the window. What would be nice to see out of a counterexample, and I think I mentioned cases like this before, would be
we lost Dan.
Yeah.
At a crucial moment as well.
Just maybe wait a second, see if he...
The thing is, though, he might not have noticed So he'll be giving his whole
mid sentence like yeah.
Yeah, is this another example? Like, I was thinking about making a pizza dough, right? When you get like all the flour and you kind of make like a pyramid out of it, like a kind of whatever triangle, and then you make a little well in the middle. You pour some water in, and then you slowly whisk it together, right? But then, like when you pour the water in to begin with, it's kind of contained like a little pool or whatever inside the flour. And you can think of it as like a circle that's like keeping the water in. And if I knocked one bit of that away, all the water would just pour out. Any bit of it that I did that to, it would like completely stop, preventing the water from coming out. So the whole thing only works as long as every single bit of it is like in place. And if any of it's not in place, none of it's doing a job at all. The water just is free to go wherever it wants.
And each one on their own, in a sense, wouldn't do anything to contain the water, plausibly.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. If I just missed one side of the pyramid or whatever, the water would just roll straight out again. You can't.
But the thought is that, it's still true, arguably, that, I don't know, one bit of the dough, if you think of or as contributing to the overall effect, well, it does nothing, right? It's not containing the water at all, absent the rest of the flour or whatever. But it's only when it's all together, all arranged in that way, that effect is produced, even in part. I'm not sure exactly what they'd say about that example. Yeah.
Yes, you can. Okay. All right. Should I finish what I was saying, or Yeah. Well, so what would be nice is to see out of a counterexample, as I was saying, was a case where each member is causally impotent, but the entire collection has a causal power nonetheless. And now I think that's where they're, on many of these counterexamples, they're going to try to press, right? Because I think they would try to claim that in many of the cases we'd want to introduce that there's some way that each of the parts does contribute to the causal power of the whole.
Yeah, that's right.
But for them, at least according to Andrew, and as I got clear in my following ensuing discussion, in order for the individuals to have that relevant causal power, their action itself alone, like independent of the rest of the group, has to be able to produce the effect or part of the effect, right? So it might be a meal or part of an extra meal, or something like that. And it seems clear to me that at least in some of these alleged counterexamples, that is the case. I think my spell case works. I also gave an example with him with like a traffic jam, like maybe one car driving down the road doesn't constantly contribute to a traffic jam or part of a traffic jam, but that's a sort of emergent effect of a group of cars driving together in a certain way. Those all seem like examples where, in their sense of relevant causal power, the individual actions do not contribute at all, but collectively they do. And we don't have to even appeal to infinite collections to get that result.
Right. And I think that's right. That sounds right to me. And I think it's also important that folks who do accept the possibility of infinite collections are going to have their own reasons for rejecting such a principle, because they think that this is just a property that those collections have.
Yeah. I think that's also going to be one really economical analysis of this, is like I sort of gestured to it before, of like a Moorian shift, where you can just sort of choose to affirm the premise or whatever the conclusion that's denied as a premise, and deny one of the conclusions, one of the premises in your conclusion, whatever. Look up Moorian shift if you don't know what I'm talking about. It's very easy. Because you might just say something like, look, the counterexample to premise one is Hilbert's Hotel, right? That all they've done is just illustrate the counterexample to this, because in Hilbert's Hotel, it does matter which room you go to or whatever. That is causal power that the group has, that none of the individuals do. So there you go. And so then it would be sort of beginning to seem a bit question begging to think that this shows that Hilbert's Hotel is impossible. But like, in order to make the generalization work, you have to assume that Hilbert's Hotel, the purported counterexample, actually isn't the counterexample. It's sort of presuming the thing in question.
Yeah, and I think it's so later on they try to say that you can't pull the move that you just named, because to there's this weird business about like you can't appeal to the second argument to refute the first, and now that's not what you're doing in the move that you just pulled. But I think it's also important that what the bottom line here is that their argument is question begging in that it assumes the denial of their interlocutor's position.
Yeah,
premise one is ruling it out. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, they want to say that that we should accept premise one because of the quote unquote independent motivation that they give for it. But as we've just been discussing, we don't think that quote unquote independent motivation is very good, and they seem to be counterexamples, not just this case at hand, but there seem to be other counterexamples as well.
Now, I think we should go on to argument 2 because we're already like an hour and 40 minutes in.
True.
Yeah. I knew this was going to happen.
Oh, just by the way, quickly, on the best response that I got from Loke on those counterexamples was like either to say, well, that's not possible because it would require violating my the model in terms of Cartesian products, and then we're going back to that. Or, I mean, he would say that would be like saying, just give another analogy where he thinks that it's clear in that case that the group wouldn't have the relevant causal power. So it'd be like the example he gave was that'd be like saying a group of penniless persons would magically have money or something like that. I don't see how that's supposed to undermine the coherence of the example that I gave in terms of spellcasting and so on. So it just seemed like a poor reply.
There might be another thing where it's like maybe the government pays out a family welfare check and not to individuals, right? And so there's a man and a woman are taken individually, don't count as a family, so that they have no causal power. They don't contribute in any way towards getting, they don't qualify even a bit towards getting this family benefit. But as soon as they have a kid together and get married, all of a sudden they've formed this group that does that on their own. None of them do it even a little bit, something like that. It feels like there are sort of patterns. The more we kick this idea about, I feel like there's probably going to be loads of these when you start really thinking it through. But let's move on to argument 2. Argument 2 is confusingly not given in premise conclusion form. Don't know why. It's called argument 2, but it's not, strictly speaking, it's not an argument. It's a paragraph that's not clear where the premises and the conclusions would go, but let's read it anyway. Now, another argument can be, he's trying to show this as a kind of big meta strategy, is that argument 1 is supposed to establish something. Argument 2 is supposed to establish the contrary of that thing. That's basically what we're doing here. So another argument can be given to show that if the number of guests/rooms were infinite, it would entail a contradiction with the above conclusion. So it would entail the negation of the previous conclusion. So to illustrate, if scenario 1, each guest n checks into each room n and eats up the meal, there would be 0 meals left. I don't know what's up. I don't know what's direction. There would be 0 meals left for the next day, and the guests would go hungry the next day, even if they check out and check in again. Sorry, I got lost in that sentence. To illustrate, if each guest checks into each room and eats up the meal, there would be 0 meals left for the next day. Right, okay, so if we just map them, guest 1 to room 1, guest 2 to room 2, that means each room and guest has a unique partner. So then that means there's no rooms left over, no guests left over, no meals left over. However, in scenario 2, if before checking in and eating the meal in the room, each guest n checks into room 2n, so the odd numbers are left, then there would be infinite meals left for the next day in the odd numbered rooms, and the guests would check in again, the odd numbered rooms, and have their stomachs filled the next day. In other words, there would be extra rooms and meals for the next day. So he wants to talk about extra rooms here, which is interesting, and brought about, caused by each guest checking into one room rather than another. So please, somebody put me out of my misery and explain what the argument is.
Well, so, it's not too complicated. I think all that's happening in this part of the argument is that, okay, forget argument 1 for a second. If it were possible to have Hilbert's hotel like this, then the guests could arrange themselves in a way to produce extra meals and extra rooms. For example, the guests in room N could instead check into room 2N, and that would leave all the odd number rooms vacant for the next day. And so they could check back into those rooms and there'd be extra meals for them to eat and so on. So in other words, here's the inference to show that actually if a Hilbert hotel were possible, then, the group would be able to cause extra meals because they could do this arranging.
Yeah.
And the thought is that, look, okay, in the first place, we have a reason for thinking that in the Hilbert hotel scenario, they would not have that power. And here's a reason for thinking that they would have that power. That's a contradiction. And so the assumption that we dismiss is the possibility of Hilbert hotel.
Right.
And that inference is made more explicit further down. Sorry.
Well, scenario 1 is just a scenario where they check in and that doesn't display the causal power to generate extra meals. So it's sort of not that helpful in establishing the conclusion that's supposed to contradict the previous one. You can almost just skip it and just go, here's the argument, and start halfway through the paragraph. Scenario 2. Each guest checks.
Yeah, that's right. The scenario 1 doesn't really add anything. It's just, I guess, more clearly illustrating how the meals would be extra in scenario 2, because they wouldn't have been there in scenario 1. But I agree, it's unnecessary.
I see. Okay, so argument 1 establishes the guests can't cause extra meals, and argument 2 establishes that they can.
Right.
Okay, good.
And before we get more into that, basically, the way they draw a contradiction, they make the contradiction there explicit, letting G stand for the principle that each guest checking to one room rather than another would not make a difference to whether there are extra meals for each guest to eat again the next day and gain extra weight. I don't know why the gain extra weight is it's not adding anything, but
yeah. So if they go for a big run and burn off all the calories and don't gain extra weight, then it doesn't.
Yes. But the point is that the way they phrase this is necessarily. Okay, this is actually. Well, whatever. They say necessarily, if Hilbert's hotel, then that principle is true, G is true. But also, and that comes from argument 1, right? Because I think it's necessarily the case that they would not have that, would not have that power. And from argument 2, they would have that power. Unfortunately, the way they phrase this now, it's kind of like a double negation going on here, because the principles regarding what it would not make a difference. So in the case of argument 2, we're denying that they would not make the difference. So they actually would make the difference. And argument 2 shows that they would be able to make, they would make a difference whether there are extra meals. And of course, these two entail a contradiction. Well, they entail a contradiction if Hilbert's hotel is possible. And so they conclude that Hilbert's hotel is not possible.
Right. So right off the bat, I think. So I haven't thought too much about this, but my instinct looking at this right now is there's this sort of simplification in the logical form here that's not really fair, because what we actually, let's say we give them everything and don't object to any of the premises or whatever, when let's say we draw some premises on an inference directly from argument 2 for them, so there is an argument. What we've got isn't simply the claim that Hilbert's hotel exists, which is, I assume, what HH means. It's just an abbreviation for Hilbert's hotel, right? So it's, I guess, if we're interpreting that as a proposition, it's saying that there is a Hilbert's hotel or something. But clearly, there's more to it than that. It was the premises of the arguments gave us the conclusion G and not G, right? It's not Hilbert's hotel, therefore G. Or if Hilbert's hotel, then G. It's if all premise 1, 1.1, 1.2, 1.3, then sort of G, I guess.
But by their list, that's a legitimate move, because they think that those things are all a matter of logic. And so they don't even need to make them explicit in order to derive this conclusion as a matter of logic. But of course, as we discussed previously, these things are not true as a matter of logic. So really, they should be added in here in order to derive the conclusion. It should be HH and the other extra logical assumptions entails G, and so on. And
that's right. It's basically like,
yeah.
Sorry, I've done it again. Go on.
No, it's fine. It's fine. Yeah.
Well, look, I'm just going to say, like, if I've got an argument that proves that P is true, right? Well, such that the conclusion is P is true, and I've got another argument such that the conclusion is that P is not true, right? Then what follows is that at least one of the premises in those arguments, right, is false. But that's it. That's all that follows. I mean, assuming classical logic, blah, 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 there can't be any contradictions, right? The fact that I've entailed P from one argument and not P from the other means that something's gone wrong with one of the premises. That's what you should think. So one of their premises must be wrong in one of those arguments. You can't say both of the arguments are right. What we should really be doing is not wondering whether Hilbert's hotel has been shown to be impossible, but which of the premises of their argument is not true. Right? That's what we should be looking at. So I don't know why we've suddenly moved from the implication of this contradiction being that one of the premises is false to it must mean that Hilbert's hotel is impossible.
It gets worse than that. So you know, I want to bring this out to the viewer. It is important that one of the assumptions that goes into both those arguments is the possibility of Hilbert's hotel, right? So it could be that when all the smoke clears, you get to say that Hilbert's hotel is impossible. But because those arguments have extra assumptions as well, you don't automatically get that conclusion. And so what's I think is really crucial to what has happened here is that they know about the kind of objections that Landon Heydrich gives, which is closely related to the unsatisfiable pair objection, right? So it's this objection according to which, well, look, you have some scenario that assumes P, Q, and R. It turns out that that conjunction is not possible because the scenario you envisioned was not possible. And now what you get to infer is not P or not Q or not R. You don't get to infer that each of those are individually false. Now, they're aware of that kind of objection because several pages on, they talk about Heydrich's version of it. But it's precisely the same objection here that they've just sort of glossed over and haven't dealt with, that what you can take away from arguments 1 and 2, so long as you formulate 2 as an argument, is that the 2 different scenarios that they described are not mutually compatible, right? But that doesn't tell you by itself that Hilbert's hotel is impossible.
Yeah. I think if we were to give a really generous, like, steel man of the case here, we would frame the first argument as involving a collection of assumptions, one of which is the possibility of Hilbert's hotel, and the rest of which are either purely logical assumptions or consequences of the purely logical assumptions plus the possibility of Hilbert's hotel. And so too for the second argument, right? Such that the only assumption that we could reasonably dismiss from either argument is the possibility of Hilbert's hotel as the only sort of non-logical assumption. Right. And then that's how you derive the conclusion that Hilbert's hotel is not possible. Of course, they can't really do any of that because both of the arguments involve extra logical assumptions. And so really, instead of just HH entails G here, it should be HH and in conjunction with the other extra logical assumptions in each of the arguments. And then, assuming that they actually do entail what they say they entail, the contradiction could be avoided not by dismissing the possibility of Hilbert's hotel, but maybe it could, you could avoid it in some other way as well by dismissing one of the other or multiple of the other extra logical assumptions. Yeah. But that would require doing more work, and I don't think it would work. But anyway.
I mean, I also think that actually now I'm looking, if you scroll back up to argument 1, I know we need to really go forwards, not backwards in this, but which premise entails that Hilbert's hotel is possible? I'm not actually sure it even is an assumption.
Yeah. So you might think it's sort of built into 4, but like if we formalize 4, it might require that Hilbert's hotel is possible. But that depends on how to understand it exactly.
Yeah, because I mentioned.
Because you're saying of that infinite number of guests that they would not have that causal power.
Yeah.
So I don't know.
I mean, I think the way that it's supposed to work is that the first argument is supposed to be something like, assuming a Hilbert hotel is possible, the guests don't have the power to leave rooms unoccupied. And then the way that the second argument is supposed to work is, assuming the possibility of a Hilbert hotel, the guests can rearrange themselves in such a way that extra meals are left. And then that's supposed to be what gives you the contradiction.
Right.
But I mean, clearly that first argument isn't going to be able to get off the ground. And then the second one, that the guests can be rearranged in such a way that meals are left over. Well, sure, I would grant that that's true about a Hilbert hotel. So I think then that really, I mean, looked at that way, it seems like the place where the problem happens, once you formalize argument 2 in some way, has got to be with one of the assumptions in argument 1.
Yeah, I think that's right. And we've looked at reasons to deny premise 1, and possibly premise 2, depending on how you catch it out. I think that I want to say possibly because it's kind of quite vague. It's still not really clear what a causal power. We know what extra means, but we don't really know what a causal power is, or what it means to have like one unit of causal power or something. But for instance, you might think something like this, right? That what a cause is a necessary and sufficient condition or something, right? So that when the cause obtains, it's enough for the effect, and it's required for the effect. Can have the effect without it. So let's suppose then that the effect is a fire that burns my house down, and the necessary and sufficient condition is that I drop a match onto a dry pile of newspapers in a sufficiently oxygenated basement or something, right? Well, that's fine. So in a way, the cause is the dropping of the match on there, but it's also like causally relevant. Let's say that somebody negligently left a load of dry newspapers around a matchbox in a highly oxygenated environment or something, right? And that, like, you might also want to dish out a bit of blame to that person, because it's not just the very last thing that happens, which takes all causal responsibility, right? Setting up the necessary conditions is also contributing. You might think, depending how woolly we want to talk about this, it's causally relevant for the effect coming about. And if we're allowed to think like that, then patently, if somebody opens a hotel and makes the choice to stay in that room and eat the meal that's in that room, that's like obviously not sufficient for there being extra meals, but it is necessary that everybody picks a room and eats the meal that's in there, because that's part of what the definition requires for it to come about. So they are at least laying the ground for the extra meal being there by contributing each in their own way, their own little necessary condition that collectively constitutes a sufficient condition if they arrange it in the right way. So it just feels to me like it's not like they don't have any causal power. Well, it's just that the very sort of specific model where it's like the amount of force that the atom contributes to the cricket ball or something. Like, you don't have it in that sense, but they do have it in the sense of like the negligent person who leaves the dry newspapers around contributes to the fire, even though he's not the one who drops the match on it. Right. And I think so on that basis, I want to object to 1.3 as well.
Yeah. No, that's very good. Because well, you can go if you want. Because
I was going to say that what Alex just said put an idea in my head, which is that if you're the kind of person that models causation as a kind of time asymmetric counterfactual, if you're David Lewis, for example, well, then you're going to say that rearranging the guests has the causal power, to the extent you can make sense of such a thing, has the causal power for producing extra meals, right? Because had it not been for the rearrangement of the guests, then the meals wouldn't have been there, right? So that the relevant counterfactual is made true by the rearrangement.
Yeah. No, this was something that came up in my discussion with him, because I think there's enough ambiguity in what their quote unquote relevant causal power is supposed to be, such that it's not obvious that 1.3 is the case. So if we think about what the group is supposed to be able to do in Hilbert's Hotel collectively, well, they pattern their room selection in a certain way such that each of them gets a room, but there's rooms left over, right? So, for example, they pattern them into such that they select only a even-numbered room. Now, if that pattern is really what's doing the work there, that pattern of room selection, well, an individual guest can by themselves contribute to part of a room pattern, right? I could select room 2, and that's part of the relevant even only room selection pattern. And if that overall pattern was the sort of direct, enough to have the direct causal power to cause extra meals, then it seems to me that an individual guest, by selecting a room that accords with such a pattern, is themselves contributing part of what's required to produce that effect. So if that's admissible for our understanding of the relevant causal power, then 1.3 is just false.
Yeah, that's my idea. You said it better than I did.
Yeah. And this came up in our discussion and didn't really go anywhere, but we ended up just moving on, I think, to presuming that they wouldn't have that causal power and then exploring further kind of examples. But yeah, that is a worthwhile point, though.
Yeah, and that's right. So I think it's time that we look at their anticipation of counterexamples and pushback and seeing what they say about it. Let's just.
Well, I was going to suggest that maybe we move on to section 4. But I don't know. We can look at their anticipation of objections if you want.
Well, I'm going to cover this objection here, right? The different senses of extra meals.
Okay, that seems like an important one.
Let's see. Yeah, they're just clarifying their sense of extra meal, since that's fine. Oh yeah, well, do we want to cover this one where they argue that it involves that concern that involves generalizing from the finite to the infinite case?
I mean, I think we've already discussed that it's clear to me that argument 1 does involve generalizing from finite case to infinite case.
Yeah, they just end up repeating the infinity times 0 equals 0 thing.
Yeah, right. Which is it's I mean, on the one hand, they modeled the finite case in a different without using Cartesian products, and then on the other hand, if you there's no argument given that that's the right formal model to use to describe powers.
Yeah, and by the way, if this is not understood as in sets here, then this expression doesn't make sense, right? It's malformed.
That's right. Yeah, right. I mean, so infinity times 0 is just not a Cartesian product. What would be a Cartesian product is a set with infinitely many members times the empty set, right? But that's not what they wrote. That's frustrating to me. But
and by the way, I think the same point has been made by Loke years ago. In fact, if I recall correctly, it's in his 2017 book with Cartesian products. At the very least, it's either in that or in something he wrote in 2021. But I know there was something previously where he made a similar point. In fact, there's something previously where he made a very similar point to the argument that comes up, that the whole argument that's in this paper. So it's not even really that original as far as the stuff that he's written on before. But anyway.
That's right. I think I had a long email exchange with him at one point, and I think some of my words from that have made it their way into this paper. I can't find it now, but there was a bit where I quibbled that he was flipping between two different notions of extra, right? Where the extra meal seemed like in the cooking case, extra meant something different from how it was used in the definition.
It's on page 4.
It's here.
Right. Yeah. Right. That's right. And my point was that that sort of equivocation between the two different meanings might have this effect on the reader, which is that you sort of nod along to the intuition pump because you're implicitly using one of those meanings, but then the intuition pump for the other premise in the argument, which is also using the word extra, is actually implicitly using the other notion. So you nod along for a different reason. And if you don't notice that there are two notions of extra going on, then you'd buy both premises when you should have, to be consistent, rejected one and only accepted the other one. And his reply to that was, they don't equivocate because they use the same meaning throughout, I think.
Right.
Which kind of missed the point, because like obviously you're saying that you use it the same in both. But it's just that, like, if you do use it like that, then the reader who, like, for instance, if you go, oh, so it's never about actually producing new things that didn't exist before, right? It's just about them being left over after you choose a room or something. Well, then maybe you're more likely to think, well, you know what, like we were talking about a moment ago, the individual does contribute something towards that, right? Because, I mean, it's just a patterning thing, and they do contribute in some way towards that. So, like, if you keep it clear, I do still think this kind of equivocation thing has some legs to it. Not that they literally have a different definition, different premises, but just unless you forget that definition and interpret it according to the kind of producing a new thing, unless you do that, one of the premises just doesn't look true anymore. Like that's the problem.
Well, so what you were saying is that the maybe much of the plausibility of one or more of the premises rests on the equivocal interpretation. And if we're clear that they're using it in the same univocal sense, this wouldn't strike most readers as plausible.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, I think there's a case being made there. I think they would respond by saying, well, no, we think that the support for the premises on the univocal reading is quite strong, blah, blah, blah. But whatever.
Yeah.
Then we just get back
fair
to
enough.
It. Yeah.
So I think maybe we don't need to look at these responses, because they just seem to be, it just seems to be like going into other ways you could be confused about stuff, right?
I commits the fallacy of composition. If I recall, they just point out that, well, it's not a fallacy of composition because they have independent support for this principle that generalizes from the few cases to the many or whatever.
Yeah, but if that is if that's a generalization, then their response to an earlier objection doesn't work.
Yeah. I mean, it's still a hasty generalization, I think, and one.
Well, it's not just that it's a hasty generalization. It's that it is a generalization in the first place. It's something that they deny.
Yeah, it's a generalization, and not like deriving some like theorem of logic or something that it really should be if it's a matter of logical necessity. But because if it's logical necessity, why not just take its negation and derive a contradiction? You know what I mean? Like, why do you have to go through all this? Well, here in this case, they wouldn't have extra causal power. Like, that would just seem unnecessary if their claim were correct in the first place.
Yeah. If only it were a logical impossibility, then it would be easy to figure it out.
Right.
All right, let's move on. Let's just do section 4 then, because, the night is not young anymore.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, I think section 4 is important. Was this a place where, you said that what they do here is...
Well, give another argument from the impossibility. So once we have the impossibility of Hilbert's Hotel, we get the impossibility of past eternal universe, or at least the falsehood of a past eternal universe. Actually, I think it's more strictly how they say it. Yeah. And that's in section 4 here.
Yeah.
So we start with that Hilbert's Hotel is impossible. And then we let PE stand for past-eternalism. There's a eternal past. C stand for creation ex nihilo obtains. K is hotel rooms and guests are created at regular time intervals. And P is that objects persist permanently. Now, setting it up this way, these formulas are malformed. The semantic interpretation doesn't really make sense because, well, I mean, imagine, given what they've said here in this first paragraph, how do you interpret C and K and P? Well, all that would say is creation ex nihilo obtains, and hotel rooms and guests are created at regular time intervals, and objects persist permanently. But you have to say that the creation ex nihilo is of the guests and rooms, and that those persist permanently. But that's not a strict consequence of the way that these formulas are constructed. But
it's worse than that, because PE is supposed to stand for past eternalism. Now, maybe you could use the phrase past eternalism to stand for a sentence, like that the universe is past eternal. But that what they've kind of written here in the quotation marks is just the phrase past eternalism.
Right, which is not itself a proposition, but that's right.
So that's a name, if anything, of a proposition. So like that means the first sentence here is ill-formed. The other thing that's frustrating about this is that they're not careful enough with their parentheses. So when I first looked at this argument, I wasn't sure whether PE was part of the antecedent or if the whole conditional was in a conjunction with PE. Now, if you read on in the argument, it has to be that PE is in the antecedent. There's no way of understanding this that is not like that. But they should have had parentheses around.
There should be a bracket around this. Yeah,
that's right.
Yeah, the whole the main operator here is meant to be the conditional, and they're right. They're not clear because you might think that it's PE and possibly C and K and P until possibly HH. But yeah, but
it's written another way too, right? Because so they're not clear that this part again about the unclearness in the antecedent, because it's the way they've written it doesn't actually force it to be true that the possible world where C and K and P obtain is the same possible world where Hilbert Hotel obtain, right? Because they put diamond in both the antecedent and the consequent.
Right.
It could be that there's one, for all they've written in that proposition, it could be that there's one possible world where C and K and P is true, and an entirely different one where HH is true.
Exactly. So yes, you might think that, imagine that there's only two worlds, right? Let's say the actual world one is, the actual world, and past eternalism is true at the actual world, at world one, and at world two, which is accessible to world one, C and K and P is true, but the past eternalism is not true. And so at world two, we might suppose that no Hilbert Hotel was ever constructed or otherwise exists. Then it seems to me that with respect to world one, you would get PE and possibly C and K and P, but not possibly HH, because HH is false at both worlds. And so 5 is not true as a matter of strict logical consequence, right? Because you could have the antecedent satisfied where the consequent is not. And it's supposed to be, at least he was clear to me anyway, that this is supposed to be a matter of strict logical consequence, not just a material conditional and thinks it's true for some reason. It's meant to be that the antecedent really does strictly entail the consequent.
Well, I mean, it shouldn't, nothing should, I mean, if this is actually a matter of logic, it shouldn't matter how we interpret the terms. So the fact that it doesn't actually say in the definitions above that the world in which creation ex nihilo obtains is the same one that Hilbert Hotel is supposed to exist in, shouldn't matter about whether, its validity will remain however you interpret those. So is what's different is the brackets really do need to be in the right place, because that might make a difference. But all they're trying to say is, this is Locke's hotel room builder example. Imagine the past is infinite, and every day God makes a new hotel room that exists forever and adds it to a hotel, right? Implicit in that is that this all happens in the same world. And I think I'm inclined to say, sure, if God was making a hotel room, if he did the same thing every day, and there were infinitely many days in the past, and there'd be infinitely many of those, the outputs of those things like hotel rooms or something. I think I want to say, okay, formalism's a bit rubbish, but I understand what's going on with that first premise. If we forget what it means, so there's just some proposition and possibly 3 other propositions, right? So P is true in the actual world. There's some world where C, K, and P are true. That implies that there's some world where HH is true. Okay. And then what follows from that is supposed to be, it's not, okay, from 4. 4 is the conclusion of...
4 is that HH is impossible. Yeah.
Where's that?
So you get
down? That's way up on page 2 of 4. Sorry.
Yeah.
Not HH. Right.
Yeah.
So we're saying, I see, because we've got the negation of the consequent in premise 5.
Then you get the negation of the antecedent. Yeah.
Right. So
Yeah,
that's a modus tollens, basically.
That's right.
Yeah. But because we have...
Apart from underneath, they start saying, oh, this is De Morgan's law and this is a strength of syllogism. Where were those helpful explanations that laws are being inferred earlier on in the paper?
Well, they're not consistent with the way that they treat arguments, right? So like the first argument is in natural language. The second is not expressed in like premise conclusion form at all. The argument that's on page 4 is formalized in modal logic. And now on page 6, we have another argument formalized in terms of formal logic. I wonder, so one thing that I've wondered when I saw that kind of inconsistency was whether Lowe contributed to some of those arguments and then Haitov did maybe like the formal ones, for example, like the modal logic arguments. Because that kind of inconsistency could be explained by the fact that it's a co-authored paper, perhaps.
Yeah, perhaps. I'm not sure. But just quickly on premise 5 here, in response to this concern, actually, I think in the Facebook thread, that point that that this is not a strict logical consequence, even if, obviously, in terms of its form, it's not a strict logical consequence. But even if we enrich the semantics and then just consider whether, if we sort of added in that, you could get a strict consequence, whatever, speaking a little bit loosely here, it doesn't seem to follow. And Joe pointed out on the Facebook thread that, yeah, you can have that where it doesn't, you can have a world where it satisfies the antecedent, but no world that satisfies the consequent. And in response, initially, or at least throughout at some point in just my interaction with him, he ended up saying, well, actually, the way to interpret K here, the time intervals that we're referring to, are the actual time intervals, are those at the actual world. And that is a little bit ambiguous because you can understand actual rigidly or non-rigidly. And if it turns out that you're understanding it rigidly, then well, 5 is going to be true, right? As a matter of, is going to follow. Once, leaving aside concerns about the exact form of it, it is going to follow that if the antecedent is true, then the consequence is true. But then, so I would point on to argue, premise 8 is going to be plainly question begging, because then you're saying, if someone thought, against the person who agreed, suppose someone agreed that Hilbert's hotel was impossible, but didn't agree that the past was eternal. Maybe past was not eternal. So maybe they're agnostic about whether the past is eternal, or maybe they think it is eternal. To them, premise 8 should be plainly question begging, because that's essentially saying that, well, there's a possible world that shares the relevant temporal intervals with the actual world at which all these rooms were constructed. And it follows from that, right, if past was actually eternal, that Hilbert's hotel was constructed. But by their own lights, Hilbert's hotel is not possible. So they should not accept premise 8 then, in that circumstance, if that makes sense. So premise 8 would be just question begging if on the sort of rigid reading about how the actual world is referred to, what the intervals in question are. But if the intervals are non-rigidly referred to the actual intervals, then the same problem arises, right? Because 5 is not going to be true as a matter of strict consequence. Because again, you could have another world, say world 2, where at that world, the intervals refer to the intervals at world 2, which perhaps are finite in extent. And so it's not going to entail that there's going to be a Hilbert's hotel constructed there or at any world. And so the same problem reemerges. So in other words, we get this sort of dichotomy. Either you rigidly refer to the durations or to the world, in which case premise 5 would be correct, but premise 8 is going to be question begging, or at least shouldn't be accepted by someone who's not already convinced that PE is false. Or you have a non-rigid reading of the reference to the intervals or to the world, in which case premise 5 is not going to be true as a matter of logical consequence. And it doesn't seem to me that there's a way out of way out of this dichotomy. he tried to take the non-rigid reading, but say that somehow it still is a strict logical consequence. But at that point, I just presented the straightforward, rigorously stated counter model, and he just had nothing to say. I mean, he just kept repeating the confused reply, and that's sort of where it ended off on that point.
Yeah,
I think it's a little bit.
Obviously, the non-rigid reading now, it's just like never going to work. Sorry, Dan, you're going to say something.
Oh, no. So I think it's a little bit worse than that, because there's this currently unsolved problem in philosophy of physics about how you identify. So if you have a relativistic space-time, how do you identify features of that space-time from one possible world to another, right? So in order to evaluate counterfactuals, for example, you'd want to be able to say that this feature of this one world is going to be identified with this feature in this other possible world. It turns out that it's unclear how to do that for relativistic spacetimes. Now, the reason I bring that up is because, well, clearly what we want to do here is we want to identify these time intervals from one possible world to another. You can't actually do that unless you solve this problem. But what's perhaps more important than that is that one of the things that's really important to Locke is that his arguments don't make, he thinks, substantive claims about the metaphysics of time. Or he wants, for example, his arguments to be consistent with both A and B theory. And I think many people would want to say that the strongest reason to be a B theorist, for example, is given by physics. If it turns out that the kinds of counterfactual claims that Locke wants to make, or the kinds of comparisons between possible worlds that he wants to make, are precisely the kinds that we don't know how to make in the context of a relativistic space-time, then it seems like it's difficult to get the argument off the ground. Hopefully that made sense.
Yeah, I think so. And I was trying to figure out in my head, let's talk this out quickly. It was premise 5, right? Problem is that you've got the past-eternalism proposition is not modal. It's not modified by modal operator.
Right.
So you assume that it means that it's supposed to be true in that thing, be true in the actual world.
Right.
And then you've got a possibility operator, which says there's some world where C, K, and P are true. Therefore, if that stuff, then there's some possible world where Hilbert's hotel is true. And the point is that a point is that those two possibility operators could be looking at different worlds for all that premise says. So is the right thing to do to simply wrap the whole premise with a single possibility operator instead of having two distributed ones, right? Well, what if it was diamond open brackets PE and C and K and P, then HH close brackets?
Yeah, but that would entail possibility change, plausibly, right? But the problem is that it's less clear why someone would accept that whole conjunction as possible. I mean, like if someone thought that Hilbert's hotel was not possible, then maybe they would think that, that sort of activity could not be carried out in that way in any world with an eternal past.
Yeah, that's right.
And like maybe there's a case to be made that, that, and I was going to talk about this as well. The example where God creates a room at a regular interval. Well, presumably you should think that's possible even at a world with an infinite past. But that would entail that Hilbert's hotel is possible because, he would already have created really many rooms.
Right.
Although there's a potential worry there that sort of reasoning might commit you to certain future-oriented ones, although we'll come to that, I guess, when you might generalize that to maybe he could, what if he was removing rooms one at a time? Maybe that would entail that there's one now. Anyway, what was I saying? I just wanted to add something, which this thought about premise 5 here, the reference to the actual world, the world or the intervals being rigid versus non-rigid. I don't know if you're familiar with this paper by Ben Waters from 2013. It's called Methuselah's Diary and the Finitude of the Past.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, if you recall the sort of reasoning there, he essentially makes a very explicit like that he's making this sort of argument, but where the reading is rigid. Where he says something to the effect of, well, so just a brief overview. He gives this sort of function, a mapping between days and days written about, where there can only be something which satisfies that function if the past is finite, right? And he makes clear the assumption which says that, well, that function is possibly realized at a world which shares the relevant temporal features with the actual world. In other words, you have a function which is only satisfied at a world with a finite history, and then you say that could be satisfied by some world that shares the relevant temporal facts with the actual world. Well, straightforwardly, that's going to entail that the actual world has a finite history, right? Because if there's a world that shares the relevant temporal facts that satisfies it, it must be that the relevant temporal facts are finite at both that world and the actual world. And so if you tie the world at which that's supposed to be possibly realized, if you tie the relevant temporal features to the temporal features of the actual world, then yeah, you can get that conclusion. But then saying that there's a possible world that shares that at which that's realized is like plainly question begging, or just assumes that the temporal facts of the actual world are as described. And that you would get the same thing if you took the rigid reading or the reference to the relevant temporal facts in premise 5 here, which would be, well, essentially you're giving something, presuming that the Hilbert total is actually impossible, then this possibility here, C and K, alleged possibility here, C and K and P, is only possible if it obtains at a world with a finite history. And that would require that the actual world also has a finite history, because we're assuming that they share the relevant temporal features. And so in the same way, on the rigid reading, you would get the possibility premise being question begging. I don't know if that added some clarity, but I found the sort of comparison between this argument and that one to be rather striking. Now, of course, and as he would go on to, I think, endorse in my discussion with him, he does not take the rigid reading, but takes the non-rigid one, but then the invalidity charge reemerges. But that's what I want to say about that.
Okay, good. Dan, do you have anything else you wanted to say about this?
No, I think that's it. What do we want to move on to next?
I think I want to move on to my bed next.
Yeah, I mean we've talked about a lot here.
Would you want to discuss briefly the symmetry breaker between past-eternalism and this future?
I suppose we should do that.
Yeah.
Well, the problem with the response it starts off with is that we've confounded one with two and missed the point of the modus tollens, in capital letters, modus tollens argument.
You're not familiar with his modus tollens argument.
Well, this is a different modus tollens argument than he usually offers. So
right.
Yeah, so the modus tollens is given just the page here. Yeah, you're just starting to see it now. Premise 1 at the bottom. Right. So if past-eternalism are true, a hotel room builder who's been building consistent aging rooms at regular times would have built Hilbert's hotel. It's very similar to that first premise we were looking at a minute ago. Premise 2, it's not possible to build a Hilbert's hotel. Therefore, the antecedent is false. So here's how I understood what me and Wes wrote about in our paper, which was that, like, what you could say is that you could do a Moorian shift and say something like, grant premise 2. Let's just say premise 2 is true. So what I'm going to do is conjoin that with the negation of the conclusion and deny premise 1. And that's doing a Moorian shift, is to sort of pivot the argument around so it points in the opposite direction instead. So let's keep premise 2 fixed. And then let's just suppose that the past is infinite. Well, if the past is infinite and it's not possible to build a Hilbert's hotel, then it can't be true that if the past was infinite, then it would be possible to build a Hilbert's hotel, right? You're able to be able to just deny it, like logically. It follows by something else that's equivalent to a modus tollens, effectively. So he thinks that this misunderstands the point of a modus tollens. And I don't really know what that means, apart from saying, like, don't do that, stop it, or something. I'm not quite sure what it means. What do you guys think?
Well, I think so. I have maybe an independent gripe with premise one in this modus tollens argument, because I reject premise one. So he says, if past-eternalism is true, a hotel builder who has been building persistent hotel rooms at regular time intervals using materials created ex nihilo would have built a Hilbert hotel. I don't think so. So the way that we usually imagine this is that for every past time that there is, over an infinite amount of time, there's this demigod or whatever who's creating a room at that time. Well, the room he's creating is just adding a room onto a hotel that's already infinite. That is, onto what is already a Hilbert hotel. And that's true for every past time. So if that's true for every past time, though, then there's no time at which this hotel builder actually managed to build an infinitely large hotel. Now, I suppose what could be said is that for every room in this, that room was added at some point. Right? For any room in that hotel, you can find some past time where that room in particular was added. But I'm not sure if that really counts as like building a Hilbert hotel. I take it that what it would take to build a Hilbert hotel, in my view, is that you start from a condition where there is no Hilbert hotel, you do something, and then there is one. But that's not what happens in the scenario we're envisioning.
Yeah, okay. I understand. I think that I've got a stronger version of that argument. I think so. I think I can improve on that a little bit. Just as a comical side, it does sound a little bit like you're saying, unless the addition of each room contributes some causal power towards the. But anyway, so that's one side. I think the stronger way to put what you were just saying, then, it's just that premise one and premise two are actually just inconsistent with one another. Right? It's not about Moorian shift or begging the question of a modus tollens or anything. It's just imagine I wrote them the other way around. So first we consider premise two, we just grant it. It's not possible to build a Hilbert hotel. Cool. I mean, and really, it's not so much it's not possible to build a Hilbert hotel. It's just not possible that there is a Hilbert hotel. It's just metaphysically impossible for one to exist, right? It's just grant that. That's what premise two is really about. Like, the only reason it's not possible to build a Hilbert hotel is because a Hilbert hotel is impossible, right? But if a Hilbert hotel is impossible, then, as you pointed out, adding a room every day is like adding a room to what? Adding a room to Hilbert's hotel every day, because each day it's not like he's made the hotel from nothing. All he's made from nothing is an individual hotel room. He's added it to a pre-existing stock of rooms that are already there. But that stock of rooms must be necessary. It must be infinite already, because it's been infinitely many times prior to any of those events of creation ex nihilo. So the problem is just that premise one is I'm asking you to imagine God adding a hotel room to Hilbert's hotel. But premise two tells you that Hilbert's hotel is impossible. So those two, like, premise one assumes Hilbert's hotel is possible, because it can't be that Hilbert's hotel is impossible, but it is possible to add a hotel room to Hilbert's hotel. Right? If Hilbert's hotel is impossible, then so is doing anything to Hilbert's hotel. If Hilbert's hotel is impossible, then so is ordering room service in Hilbert's hotel. Right? It's just the possibility of Hilbert's hotel prevents any. If P is impossible, then P and Q is impossible, just because P is impossible. Right? It's like basically a piece of modal logic.
I think there's something that's really important that should be pointed out about why what you just said doesn't run into the fallacy that they accuse you of. So the fallacy they accuse you of, they use this proof by contradiction, the proof that square root of 2 is irrational, in order to construct some kind of argument that you're making a fallacy. That the fallacy is supposed to be something like this, I think. When you do a proof by contradiction, you begin by assuming that, in this case, the square root of 2 is rational. And then you show that results in a contradiction, so you can infer that the square root of 2 is not rational. Now, if their argument had been, oh, well, suppose that the past is infinitely long. In that case, you run into a contradiction, but contradiction is not possible. Therefore, an infinite past is not possible. That would have that kind of argument have the same structure as the proof that the square root of 2 is irrational. But that's not, in fact, the argument that they wrote. Right? I mean, they didn't do a proof by contradiction. They wrote, as they tell us, a modus tollens argument. And a modus tollens argument, the first premise of a modus tollens argument is a conditional. A conditional is false just in case the antecedent is true and the consequent is false. Now, what you're pointing out is that suppose the second premise were true, that it's not possible to build a Hilbert hotel. Well, in that case, even if the antecedent were true, the consequent wouldn't be. And so the first premise would just be false. Right. And that's, so the problem here is not that you've misunderstood how modus tollens arguments work. The problem is that they've misunderstood how modus tollens arguments work. And for some reason, they think that they're proved by contradictions when they're just clearly not.
Yeah, right. And that's why when I first started saying it's like a Moorian shift, I think basically it's the same thing. It's just once you realize that premise 2 is incompatible with premise 1, it gives you a reason at least to shift it in that way I was saying, where you go like, how about I deny premise 1 and I accept premise 2 and the conclusion? We've still got the same logical relationship. It's just I've switched around which ones I'm willing to accept. And
in fact, you could reorganize this into a modus ponens argument by switching 2 and 3, and then, or I guess you couldn't just switch 2 and 3. You could do a little more than that. But anyway, you could reorganize this into your own modus ponens argument or your own modus tollens argument for that matter, and then you could accuse them of fallaciously misunderstanding the argument that you've constructed.
Well, yeah, the argument that I was suggesting wouldn't be a modus ponens either, really. It would be premise 1, it's not possible to build a Hilbert's hotel. Premise 2, past-eternalism is true. Therefore, conclusion, if past-eternalism were true, well, it's not the case that if past-eternalism were true, then a hotel room builder, blah, blah, blah. Right? It's like you're taking the middle premise of a modus ponens and the conclusion and denying the conditional premise. So I don't know that that's got a name in logic as such, but it's logically equivalent anyway.
So a Moorian shift is where you take 2 and 3, negate both of them, and then switch them.
All right, so maybe it's not actually even technically a Moorian shift, but it's the same idea. That's the idea. And I think it makes sense. I mean, all you have to do is once it becomes apparent that premise 1 is asking you to imagine a situation where there's a Hilbert's hotel, and premise 2 tells you that there can't be any such Hilbert's hotel, then it's obvious that then they're never going to be true together. So the best you can do is to deny premise 1.
I was thinking that maybe there's they could rephrase or restate 1 a little bit differently, where it said something like, well, if P were true, then it's possible that all these things obtain, but the possibility of all those obtaining would entail that it's possible that a Hilbert's hotel obtains, and so it's not possible that a Hilbert's hotel obtains, and so they conclude that P is false. I think that's better. I think and the words about building a Hilbert's hotel, does having built it require this sort of transition from not having built it to having built it, when that's not true in the described scenario where there's at every point there's already a Hilbert's hotel. I think you can avoid worries about what building entails by replacing this with just, well, then a Hilbert's hotel would exist, right, or something like that, without saying something stronger about how the builder built it or whatever. But I mean, I don't know. I'm inclined to say that someone could still have the view that past-eternalism is true at some worlds, and it's true at the actual world and maybe at other worlds, or for all they know, it might be true of the actual world. But this sort of building procedure or production of rooms, whatever, is only carried out at some of the worlds at which past-eternalism is false, and at none of the worlds at which past-eternalism is true, and that Hilbert's does not obtain at any world. Now, you might think that there's some other reason for thinking that Hilbert's hotel obtains at some worlds, if past-eternalism is true or possibly true. But it doesn't seem to me that they've given a good argument here for thinking so. So that's my concern there.
Yeah, I think that's right. So it almost turns into a sort of unsatisfiable pair thing, because it's like you could sort of say something like, sure, I mean, in all those worlds which are finite in the past, yeah, God could have been doing nothing but making hotel rooms the whole time, because that would only result in something possible anyway, so no problem. But then you want to say this thing that seems objectionable, which is it's only in those universes which are past eternal that God couldn't have been filling it with hotel rooms, right? And it's a bit like I was making that joke about the Biden economy. It's like whenever Trump finds something he doesn't like about the economy, that's the Biden economy. And anything that's good, it's his economy. And you might think, well, that's objectionable in the same way, right? How come God never spends his whole time making hotel rooms in a world that's past eternal? Isn't that just kind of convenient for me if modal space looked like that? But why actually think that it does look like that? And I think the answer is just that, again, comes back to premise 2. I mean, at the end of the day, if Hilbert's hotel is impossible, right? If that's part of the assumptions that we're using here, if we're trying to think of what follows if all of the premises are true, which is the whole point of an argument. It seems to me that's the point of any argument, not just a modus tollens, but like point of an argument is what follows from the premises, right? And what follows from the conjunction of both of those two premises seems to be exactly that, right? If Hilbert's hotel is impossible, then God could have spent quite a lot of the time in the infinite past. At any finite number of days, he could have spent making hotel rooms, but he couldn't have spent all of them. And like, if you think that's weird, it's like, do you think God could just make a hotel room all in one go? Right? Just snap his fingers and say, let there be an infinite hotel all in one go, right? Because if God could make an infinite hotel all in one go, then and Hilbert's hotel was impossible, then it would imply that God was impossible. So, you can't have that. So what do? You have to say something like God can make a hotel that's as big as you like, but not infinitely big. Right? For any natural number n, it could have n many rooms in it, but it can't have so many rooms that each natural number has a room, right? But that's just to impose this restriction. And keep going, follow that through, and just say the same thing that we just said there about how many rooms he could make in a given day, and apply that to how many he could make over a given stretch of days. It just seems to be exactly the same condition. So it's not even like, I think once you start, like when you immediately say, maybe he just couldn't spend all the time in the past making hotel rooms, it sounds like it's going to be ad hoc. But then when you start thinking it through and add in premise 2, which I'm supposed to be considering at the same time, because like I said, that's the point of an argument, then it's like you can really easily construct a coherent story, which means that God couldn't have done what premise 1 says that he could have done. And so to me, it's just a sort of zeitgeist thing. You can just sort of like take the glasses off and put the other ones on, and you see the world a slightly different way, and then it's fine. And this whole worry just sort of goes away. Anyway, that's probably enough on that.
Yeah. Just a quick addition on the sort of unsatisfiable pair type response. Like, I mean, look, suppose we agree, although I don't think any of us agree that Hilbert's hotel is logically impossible, but suppose we thought that it was logically impossible. Then, and we agreed that PE and C and K and P entails that Hilbert's hotel is possible, or at least the possibility of PE and C and K and P entails that Hilbert's hotel is possible. Well, you just have a large conjunction there that is impossible on our view, right? Because it would entail something impossible. That doesn't tell us which part of that is not true or whether any part of that is actually impossible, right? In the same way, we might think that PE is possible. We might think that C and K and P is possible, but that there's no possible world at which they both obtain. And so any world at which God is creating rooms is one at which he either is only, created finitely many rooms, or there's only a finite history or whatever. And so no Hilbert's hotel obtains. Or, otherwise there's no Hilbert's hotel. I mean, we don't have to suppose that at least one world is a Hilbert's hotel, even if past-eternalism is possible. And that's a consistent view. I mean, you might think that there's some principle of modal inference or whatever by which we could infer that if P is possible and C and K and P is possible, that the whole conjunction is possible. But I don't think they've offered that, or at least something compelling to that end. So that's kind of my ultimate worry there. But of course, I think the argument goes wrong in many ways before we even get to this point. But yeah.
Okay, right. I think we do final thoughts. So Dan, what were your closing? Because I literally I just need to go to sleep in about 2 minutes. So no more.
Yeah, right. So I mean, I think that I'm not convinced by the argument that they've put forward, and I think that in each part of this argument, I don't really see anything that's novel about the paper they've written. That was my initial reaction when I first read this article, that it seems to be a rehashing of the same argument we've seen before. I think I'm still convinced that that's so, that this article doesn't substantially advance the dialectic beyond where we've already gotten to.
And Troy.
Yeah. Just on that. Yeah. The addition of the meal stuff gives it maybe a veneer of novelty, but it really isn't. The only thing that's sort of novel is the additional like causal principle, and then some of the stuff they say about the asymmetry breaker between the past and future cases. But yeah, overall, I think it's quite poor. Just to summarize some of the concerns. Yeah, like premise one from the argument one just seemed to, first of all, not be a matter of logic, even though they require it to be so. And two, seem to be sort of implausible, question making, and admit of various counterexamples as discussed. And premise two is just a consequence of premise one. And premise three, regarding the individual guest not having the relevant causal power in Hilbert wasn't obvious. And so there's a way to understand that where they actually do have that causal power. And then argument two, deriving the contradiction, was there were some issues there, but maybe we can, like, if the issues with premise argument one were otherwise resolved, and it's not too bad, you can sort of patch it up a little bit in a way that sort of makes sense.
Sorry, do you mean the argument? I think you mean the one where you can patch together is the one where they combine arguments 1 and 2 into a formal argument, which isn't what they call argument 2, right? Argument 2 is this paragraph.
You're right. Yeah. Argument 2 is sort of fine. That's just for thinking that, in the Hilbert case, they would be able to organize themselves in a way to produce extra meals. And that's just if they, for example, move into the even numbered rooms only, then that's a way of quote unquote causing extra meals. I mean, leaving aside worries about whether that actually counts as causing extra meals, as Alex discussed, then that's fine. And then, the sort of further argument, combining arguments 1 and 2 to derive the conclusion that Hilbert is impossible. Yeah, that seems, well, it's problematic for the reasons we discussed, in the sense that it doesn't follow from Hilbert alone that this principle is true, according to argument 1. It follows from Hilbert and the other assumptions, which are not merely principles of logic. And so you can't just dismiss them when writing out this conditional here. But, I mean, if you added those in, and then you could get something, but then you have to say that it's not those other things that are false. It's a Hilbert assumption, or possibility of Hilbert which is false. Or it's not just those things that are false in conjunction. It's that Hilbert is impossible altogether. And that's going to be a harder case to make. If they could argue that each of those assumptions were matters of logic, like principles of logic, then sure, then this would follow, but they're not going to be able to do that. So, skipping over some of the concerns there. And then it just got us back to the argument from the impossibility of Hilbert to the falsehood of past-eternalism. Actually, I just noticed that the section of the title, they say, can be used to argue for the impossibility of past-eternalism, but the conclusion is not that past-eternalism is impossible. It's just that past-eternalism is false. Now, I guess they could maybe rephrase their argument to get that stronger conclusion, but they don't get it here anyway. But that's another thing worth pointing out.
They don't, because it seems like it's just weird to distinguish modally the PE assumption from the CK and P assumptions. Like, I don't know why PE has to be in the actual world As long as surely it's what matters is the same world, right? If the universe was eternal, God existed, made hotel rooms, and they persisted, then in the very same world there'd be a Hilbert's Hotel. Like, why separate the modal operators out as if they should be treated independently? It's just bizarre. But it's not a choice. That it means. I mean, if the whole formula had been prefixed with a modal operator,
right?
After too tired to think it through properly, but would that mean that you'd be able to then prefix the possibility operator into the conclusion? So it'd be not possible.
Yes, you would, right? If you had possibly, and then in brackets PE and C and K and P close brackets, that would entail possibly HH, charitably. But then when they go on to, well, first of all, how are they going to support that possibility claim? Right? Why think that those things are all possibly realized at the same world, right? But if they could do that, then the rest would follow. If they said possibly C and K and P, like if they said possibly C and K and P together, right, then it would just follow that not possibly. Well, actually, no, that doesn't follow.
We probably should have done this portion of the reasoning earlier.
I mean, look, so, okay, if you put the diamond in the front of PE, then you're still going to be able to say, using 5 and 4, you could still do modus.
Hang on. Are you still? I was saying the diamond in front of everything, right? Diamond brackets PE and C and K and P close brackets. If you had diamond, right? But then how do you get it?
So look. So if you had diamond and then that whole antecedent, so that's your conditional, right? Your conditional has diamond in front of it. The consequent is still diamond HH. Mm-hmm. They have an earlier argument. So 4, right, is not diamond HH.
Right.
You can still take the two of those, 4 and 5, to get 6.
Well, no, instead of how they wrote 6 here, it would be not possibly PE and C and K and P.
Right.
My question is, how do you get from that to not possibly PE?
Oh.
Granting possibly C and K and P.
Well, I don't think you can. Because what you'd have is...
that's what I was saying. That didn't seem to me that you could.
Yeah, right. Okay, I'm caught up now. So what you'd have then is you'd have box, so necessarily not, and that whole antecedent, and then using De Morgan's, you'd just be able to say necessarily not that big disjunction.
Right.
Either not PE or not C or not K or not P.
What you could not get is necessarily either not PE or not C and K and P. Right. That would not follow. You need to have something, because then they could say, well, if it's not the case that necessarily not C and K and P, because we have possibly C and K and P. So we'd have necessarily not PE, but that you wouldn't get that first step from the first premise. So I don't see how they would get even the conclusion out of that. So, I mean, I don't know. The other thing is that the way it's phrased here, where P is asserted about the actual world and not just the possibility claim. Like in my ensuing discussion with, and I don't want to spend more time going back into this, my ensuing discussion with a local on Facebook was that, well, because the regular intervals that refer to those at the actual world, it's relevant that P is asserted to be true at the actual world, because now their intervals are tied in some way to there, even though it's not rigid. Anyway, not to rehash that, but somehow that's meant to make the inference possible, although it doesn't work. It doesn't seem like there's a way to salvage it here that would make it work. But whatever, I'm not opposed to there being some sort of inference that if past-eternalism is possible, then Hilbert's Hotel would be possible. I mean, I would grant that anyway, because I think Hilbert's Hotel is possible and past-eternalism is possible. But it doesn't seem to me that they've given it here anyway. So I'll just kind of leave it there unless someone wants to add anything onto that.
Any trivial thing I want to add to that is, why is it K? There's no K in the expression that defines this in. Hotel room created a regular time. Why is it K?
I don't know. It's like he chose a letter at random, I guess.
Yeah, and why is PE 2 letters, whereas the others are only 1? I mean, just call one and just put it P. Past-eternalism is P, or make it a proposition, but at least just call it P. Call the next one.
He already
P,
has a P.
Call the next
Object
one
persist.
R.
Yeah, but then the object is permanently cut. It could be O then, like whatever. Like make it one letter.
Just put it P, Q, R, and S. They don't. I mean, or have it as like something that relates to the thing, like PE relates to past-eternalism, or have it as an unrelated single symbol like K. But don't do both of them. Like, just pick one of them. Like, this sort of thing's like, it's not really a mistake.
Yeah, this is generally bad practice.
Yeah.
Why have HH? Why don't just have H? Right? Like I don't, you know. Yeah.
Exactly. So there's things like that that just they're unnecessary. They don't. It's hard to say that you should reject a paper for doing that type of thing, but I kind of feel like reviewers should insist. You know, why are you doing it in a weird ad hoc way where there's loads of sort of asymmetries that don't mean anything and stuff? Like, just simplify it, clear out anything that might confuse the reader, and make it clear and simple. I mean, that should be the overriding virtue that you're going for. And I just don't know why some of the arguments have premises, some of them's just a paragraph. Like, why do that? Just think, like, what doesn't help your audience if you do it like that. I don't know.
Anyway, I think we should wrap this up.
It does make it feel kind of amateurish, in my opinion. But anyway,
we should wrap this up so that Alex can go to bed.
You're right. I'm getting cranky. I need to get. All right, good. All right, well, let's just stop there then. Thanks both for spending, let's say, generously 3 hours of your time doing this. It's been fun.
Yeah, this has been great.